Hi, this is Krishna Iyer with the Iyer think tank in Delray Beach. This podcast is starting another book, Noam Chomsky At War with Asia. It is Noam Chomsky's book on the Indochinese conflict. It is a comprehensive study of the media. A lot of the media is included in this racist, murderous war by the white butchers of the United States. It was a massive bombing campaign and a massive slaughter campaign by the American government, to slaughter the Indochinese people. And I'm including the Google Drive link in my description section, so you can download the book. It'll be there. I recommend you read the book because occasionally I do make modifications to the prose, depending on clarity, depending on my need for additional clarity, and I make it so that it's for me it seems like it'll come across a little clearer because I do review my own presentations, so that's why I do that. Then I have this other book additionally, which I'm not going to be able to review because it is too long, but it is a great book to go through if you're, a medical personnel or some sort of person who wants to know about these war crimes. It is Against the Crime of Silence, Proceedings of the International War Criminal Tribunal, the Russel Tribunal of the war crimes, and it discusses all of the war crimes in Indochina, including all the medical complications, the spinal cord injuries, what patients faced. A lot of that stuff is there. In addition to, just general bombing campaigns, napalm, biological weapons, chemical weapons, starvation, all of the diseases that they inflicted on the Vietnamese people. They, spread diseases through, contaminating prisoners with, TB, like prisoners with TB were kept with prisoners that were, well and healthy. And so a lot of them died with TB, similar to that, like other infectious diseases. A lot of prisoners died. So that's an excellent book. That'll also be in my Google Drive link so that you can download it. It is available. You can read it, download it if you wish to do so. So let's get started. Basically, I just wanted to make a note that I'm not going to discuss Against the Crime of Silence or the Russel Tribunal because, it is too long, and it will give you the ideas of the U.S. government, murderous American white butchers, and their, physical, psychological, and medical effects of their war of aggression and their war of colonial butchery in Indochina. So we're going to discuss the first chapter of Noam Chomsky's book, At War with Asia, and the American racist butcher campaign by the white supremacists of the United States government in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The French plantation slavery system, cloaked in secrecy and white supremacist racist oppression, was similar to the American enslavement of the negro in the United States. This affected the people of Indochina. This also follows their lynching of blacks, Mexicans, and Chinese in white vigilante orgies of murder against these people in the United States. Similarly, the French brutalized the indigenous Indochinese people. The racist American murderous butchers followed French colonial rule with their own visions of racist subjugation of the Indochinese people at the guns of the U.S. congressional white supremacist Nazi fascist gangsters, as well as multiple presidents, including Dwight Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, and Richard Nixon. The war lasted 28 years from 1946 to 1974 and was associated with more than 5 million casualties. All Indochinese peasants, intellectuals, Vietnamese, Cambodian, and Laotian scholars, professors, and other individuals, including farmers and union activists. The idea was to destroy the democracy in Vietnam that the nationalists were trying to bring to success following hundreds of years of colonial rule. They burned books, murdered professors, destroyed universities and schools, bombed peasant unions, and murdered indiscriminately civilians. The butcher Lyndon Johnson made the destruction of Indochina his primary goal during his American term, in addition to his racist, oppressive genocide against the Indonesian people. This anti-communist and anti-Chinese obsession by the Nazi American white murderous fascist gangsters was reflected by the question to Johnson as to who you are waging war against in Vietnam, to which he replied, the Vietnamese people. Each individual atrocity is too numerous to account, but there are multiple sources, including the War Crimes Tribunal of Russel, which is in the book Against the Crime of Silence, that gave a good review of the atrocities committed by the American butchers in Indochina. The book reviews spinal cord snappings, amputations, decapitations, deliberate machine gunning of peasants and local individuals, bombing with napalm and vomiting gases, and burning of the skin of these people, vomiting gases used against civilian populations, white phosphorus, cluster bombs, B-52 saturation bombing to destroy the population, and near genocidal results of a massive use of indiscriminate U.S. firepower against the civilian population. The American racist Nazi murderous gangsters conducted gang rape by its soldiers of peasants in South Vietnam, tortured the population with drowning electric shock, amputations, fingernail eviscerations, teeth extractions, cutting breasts and genitals off, decapitations, and other abuses. The basis of the United States war was their lack of respect of the needs of the third world people of Indochina to control their own oil resources. The typical colonial, racist, American, Nazi, murderous gangster action that they have committed throughout the world. American imperialism was marching throughout Southeast Asia through military dictatorships in Thailand, South Korea, Singapore, and Indonesia. They could not accept the Indochinese people as equals and considered racial purity in their attributions that this race was a mad Asian race of bloodlust Asians that were murderers and criminals and low level of intellect. The standard American racist trope, propagated by both their media, including the New York Times, Newsweek, and Washington Post, as well as their academia at Harvard, Yale, Princeton, MIT, Cornell, University of California, and University of Michigan, were all involved in this mafia criminal enterprise in Indochina. Major scholars proposed as the indiscriminate bombing of the people of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia was the only way to win this war and destroy quote-unquote communism. Their distorted and paranoid perceptions of communism were propagated by their American Nazi murderous white gangsters of John Foster Dulles and Dwight Eisenhower, who would not allow Indochina to fall to nationalists who sought their birthright privileges of oil, natural resources, rubber, textiles, rice plantations, and other things rich in this nation. This resulted in Dulles refusing the acceptance of the Geneva Accords and Paris Conference Accords, as well as the Nuremberg trials in conduct of this war. The South Vietnam regime was an example of an American colony. This repressive regime was associated with concentration camps, forced relocation, indiscriminate murder of civilians, police arbitrary detention and imprisonment, and large torture houses. The people of Vietnam were relocated to concentration camps where they were starved, murdered, and tortured. Saigon is also a corrupt tyranny which resulted in no financial gains for the government, and all of the cash being siphoned by the United States into its treasury and stealing all of the money of this country. The racist American Nazi murderous white gangsters did not pay reparations, did not apologize, did not make any attempt at closure with the Indochinese, a testament to their obsessive paranoid interest in worldwide enslavement, racist murder, and racist torture that they exhibited in the United States against the blacks, Mexicans, and Chinese throughout their history. So let's get started. It's a long chapter. We don't want to dilly dally. It's Indochina and the American Crisis, Chapter 1. In 1947, commenting on the rising tide of anti-communist hysteria in the United States, John K. Furbank made the following perceptive observations. Our fear of communism, partly as an expression of our general fear for the future, will continue to inspire us to aggressive anti-communist policies in Asia and elsewhere, and the American people will be led to think and maybe honestly believe that the support of anti-communist governments in Asia will somehow defend the American way of life. This line of American policy will lead to American aid to establish regimes which attempt to suppress the popular movements in Indonesia, Indochina, the Philippines, and China. Thus, after setting out to fight communism in Asia, the American people will be obliged, in the end, to fight the peoples of Asia. The American aggression abroad will be associated with an increasing trend toward anti-communist authoritarianism within the United States, which its victims will call fascism, and which may eventually make it impossible to have discussions like this one today. This American fascism will come, if it comes, because American liberals have joined the American public in a fear of communism from abroad rather than fascism at home as the chief totalitarian menace. These remarks have proved to be accurate. The events of April 1970 reveal once again how the policy of anti-communism draws the American government step by fateful step into an endless war against the peoples of Asia and as a natural concomitant toward harsh repression and defiance of law at home. What is the nature of the source of these aggressive anti-communist policies? The British economist Joan Robinson has described the American crusade against communism in the following terms. It is obvious enough that the United States crusade against the communism is a campaign against development. By means of it, the American people have been led to acquiesce in the maintenance of a huge war machine and its use by threat or actual force to try to suppress every popular movement that aims to overthrow ancient or modern tyranny and begin to find a way to overcome poverty and establish national self-respect. In those countries whose governments have been prepared to accept American support, aid is given in a form which may do more to inhibit development than to promote it. Rhetoric aside, the underlying assumption is formulated not very differently by the makers of American policy. Consider, for example, how the threat of communism to the American system is defined as an extensive study sponsored by the Woodrow Wilson Foundation and the National Planning Association, a study that involved a representative segment of the tiny elite that largely determines foreign policy, whoever is technically in office. The primary threat of communism, as they see it, is the economic transformation of the communist power in ways which reduce their willingness and ability to complement the industrial economies of the West. Correspondingly, the American crusade against communism is not a campaign against all forms of development, but only against the effort of indigenous movements to extricate their societies from the integrated world system dominated largely by American white capital, and to use their resources for their own social and economic development. A Korean journalist writing in Japan put the masked martyr precisely in discussing his own country. Put the matter precisely in discussing his own country. The economic policy of the Park administration in South Korea seemingly draws admiration, not because its economic construction is being carried out in a firm and reasonable manner, but because South Korea is pursuing an open door economic policy and offers abundant, low-cost labor. What results from the continued willingness, spurred by occasional intervention and subversion, to complement the great industrial economies is seen most clearly in the case of Latin America, traditionally a preserve of the United States. The 1960s, one recalls, were to be a decade of development under the Alliance for Progress. It might be argued that the second half of the decade provides an unfair test given the exigencies of the Vietnam War. Consider then the first 5 years. The record was summarized by the editor of Inter-American Economic Affairs. During that period, 1960 to 1965, the rate of economic growth dropped sharply from the average for 1950 to 1955 and 1955 to 1960, and the change in the growth rate per capita was even more adverse. During that period, the distribution of income became even more unsatisfactory as the gap between the rich and poor widened appreciably. During most of the period, a very heavy proportion of the disbursements went to military regimes which had overthrown constitutional democratic governments. And at the end of the period, with almost half of the population under military rule, a significant proportion of the aid was going to not to assist free men and free government, quote unquote, in alliance rhetoric, but rather to hold in power regimes in which the people had lost their freedom. Surveying the situation today, Frederick Claremont reports that United States corporations and their multinational subsidiaries currently control between 70 to 90% of the raw material resources of Latin America and more than 60% of its industrial plant. Its public utilities, its banking, commerce, and foreign trade relationships are in the hands of U.S. corporations or their subsidiaries. He cites the report of a Brazilian industrial commission sponsored by the government but never published in Brazil. In 1968, foreign capital controlled 40% of the nation's capital market, 62% of its foreign trade, 82% of its maritime transport, 100% of motor vehicle output, 100% of tire production, more than 80% of the pharmaceutical industry, nearly 50% of the chemical industry, 59% of machine production, 62% of auto parts factories, 48% of aluminum, 90% of cement, and 77% of the overseas airlines. Half the foreign capital comes from the United States, followed by German, English, French, and Swiss capital. One recalls the statement of Chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee in 1965, celebrating the overthrow of the Goulart government. Every critic of foreign aid is confronted with the fact that the armed forces of Brazil threw out the Goulart government, and the U.S. military aid was a major factor in giving these forces an indoctrination in the principle of democracy and a pro-U.S. orientation. Many of these officers were trained in the United States under the aid program. They knew that democracy was better than communism. The outstanding Latin American correspondent of Le Monde explains in more detail how the Brazilian military elite conceived the principles of democracy in a pro-United States orientation. Accepting the principle of total war against subversion, the doctrine of national security considers that the underdeveloped countries must aid the leading state of the Christian world to defend civilization by furnishing it with primary materials. The other effects of the love for democracy might be cited, for example, the benefits to the American steel industry of a protected Latin American market guaranteed by tide loans, or simply the profitability of investment, profit, remittances, and other returns on investment were 3 times the average annual inflow of direct investment, including reinvestment of profits from 1960 to 1966. The ideology of anti-communism has served as a highly effective technique of popular mobilization in support of American policies of intervention and subversion in the post-war period, an average of one such episode every 18 months, as one author notes. It is an ideology adapted to an era when the civilizing mission of the white race can no longer be invoked. Thus, when the United States conquered the Philippines from its own population at the turn of the century, it was stoutly bearing the white man's burden, whereas today in Indochina, it is defending the free world against the savage communists. In fact, in both cases, it is merely fulfilling the prophecy of Brooks Adams, who proclaimed 3/4 of a century ago that our geographical position, our wealth, and our energy preeminently fit us to enter upon the development of Eastern Asia and to reduce it to part of our own economic system. Although many American scholars and ideologists refuse to admit it, the Vietnam War was simply a catastrophic episode, a grim and costly failure in the long-term effort to reduce Eastern Asia and much of the rest of the world to part of the American-dominated economic slavery system. The foreign editor of Look magazine put the matter quite accurately when he wrote that in Vietnam, we have overreached ourselves. America's historic westward driving wave has crested, temporarily at least. A generation ago, a few Americans failed to perceive hypocrisy and self-delusion of Japanese leaders such as Toho and Matsuoka when they explained their invasion of China as an altruistic gesture by Japan which was paying the price of that leadership of Asia demands and attempting to save Asia from the twin evils of communism and dismemberment by the imperial powers of the West. Japan, they insisted, sought only to create a co-prosperity sphere in which its capital and technological resources would contribute to the development of the entire region, to the creation of an earthly paradise. Surely no one could accuse the Japanese of crass economic motives. Was it not obvious that Japan was spending more on the war in China than it could possibly gain in return, protecting the true nationalists of China from communist bandits and imperial agents? Similarly, today, American critics of the war carefully explain the absurdity of the assumption that material interest led to the tragic crisis of Vietnam. Surely the United States is spending more on the war in Indochina than it can possibly hope to gain in return. And today, Japanese observers can perceive clearly that the American government is engaged in continuing French suppressions of the Vietnamese people's struggle for independence. They understand that behind this concept of shielding Asia from domination by any single power, whether pre-war Japan or present-day China, there appears to be a hidden American desire itself to play the role of top dog in Asia. The Japanese correspondent of the Far Eastern Economic Review, Koji Nakamura, puts the matter plainly and simply. In Japanese eyes, the American behavior and action in Indochina is a Xerox copy of the Japanese behavior and action in China not many years ago, which eventually led to the rise and fall of an imperial Japan. What he fails to add, however, is that Imperial Japan was not the world's mightiest military and industrial power. Quite generally, the leaders of imperialist powers and their spokesmen have been able to persuade themselves and the domestic population, so long as the costs are not too high, of the benevolence and rationality of the measures they undertake to extend their power. As John Adams once said, power always thinks it has a great soul and vast views beyond the comprehension of the weak, and that it is doing God service when it is violating all his laws. There is no reason to expect Americans to be immune to this historical process of self-delusion. And in fact, discussions of American policy are replete with references to its moral character, misplaced moralism in the eyes of many critics. The American self-image is expressed with great clarity by former Ambassador Charles Bolin in a recent essay on post-war American policy. Commenting on the post-war years, he writes, "One of the difficulties of explaining this policy, even in the early days, and even more now, is that our policy is not rooted in any national material interest of the United States, as most foreign policies of other countries in the past have been." The political commentator TRB of the New Republic, strongly opposed to the war, writes that we are a deeply moral nation. Don't let anybody tell you the contrary. Referring to, quote, Johnson trying to carry the great society everywhere, Kennedy seeking to eliminate revolutionary wars, he comments, do not include such idealism. The rhetoric may be inflated, but the idealism, he insists, is beyond question. The moral pull for the U.S. to go on rescue missions will always be enormous. There are a dozen such spots today. Our conscience aches for them, but our capacity is probably limited. The lesson he draws from Vietnam is that our capacity is limited. This is a rescue mission that we should not have undertaken. We should have resisted the moral pull, and he surely represents a fair segment of enlightened American opinion in this interpretation of what he regards, of course, as the tragedy of our intervention in Vietnam. TRB also expresses widely held feelings when he writes of the agonizing moral dilemma we now face. The problem is, what is our primary duty? Is it to South Vietnamese who might be massacred if we quit? Or to the 150 to 200 American boys who lose their lives weekly if we stay? I don't think the U.S. has ever faced before such a question. What of the South Vietnamese who might be massacred if our collaborators were to win, or those who are now being massacred by our military actions? It is remarkable that they do not appear to figure in our moral dilemma and are not so much mentioned by TRB, though he admits that the North Vietnamese victims of the American bombing might have thought they were atrocities too. TRB is right not to ridicule the feelings of those who would support virtually any act committed by their government out of a sense of idealism. He is right as well to point to the agonizing moral dilemma. It is not without historical precedent. It is, for example, a dilemma that might have been posed by German moralists in 1944 had they been faced with the demand that they withdraw from France. What of the collaborators who might be massacred if we quit, who were in fact massacred in the thousands when France was abandoned by the West or Wehrmacht? TRB is also right in saying, as he does, that people can vote in other ways than at the polling booth, by defending themselves, say, or by dying for their country. That, he writes, would be evidence that South Vietnam really is a country. And he testifies to the amazing blindness of this deeply moral nation, in that he simply cannot perceive that there are those in South Vietnam who have been dying for their country and defending it with indescribable heroism against the blows of the idealists who seek to eliminate revolutionary wars everywhere, to carry the great society everywhere. Returning to an earlier day, during the period of its industrial domination, Britain advocated economic liberalism not merely on the grounds of the material advantages that such policies afford to the dominant power, but on universal grounds, protectionism being conceived, in Palmerston's phrase, as a principle of fatal injury to the country and inimical to the prosperity of every country to whose affairs it may be applied. Similarly, in the period following World War II, the United States has tended to adhere to this doctrine highly selectively, to be sure, insofar as it guarantees American ascendancy, and to urge others to accept free and unconstrained economic relations. This was natural enough. The United States emerged from the Second World War with overwhelming power relative to other industrialist societies. Its industrial production had quadrupled, while every other major industrial society had been devastated or severely crippled. Gabriel Kolka, in an extremely important study, has shown in detail how the United States proceeded during the war to lay the groundwork for a post-war economic empire, particularly at the expense of our ally, Great Britain. Similarly, post-war loans were used to compel the British to dismantle the imperial preference system and restrict nationalization. As William Clayton, Undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs, put it, we loaded the British loan negotiations with all the conditions that the traffic would bear. Lefebvre formulates the outlines of amnesties. America's European policy is advocated by the American executive branch. A rejuvenated Europe could offer many advantages to the United States: eradicate the threat of continuing nationalism and spreading socialism by releasing and stimulating the investment of private capital, maintain demand for American exports, encourage Europeans to produce strategic goods which the United States could buy and stockpile, preserve European and American control over Middle Eastern oil supplies from militant nationalism, which might endanger the weakened European holdings, and free Europeans from economic problems so they could help the United States militarily. Meanwhile, the economic relationship with Latin America and Canada could be assumed. None had to be developed. As Henry Stimson put it rather nicely, in trying to work out a strategy for breaking down European regional systems while preserving our own, I think that it's not asking too much to have our little region over here, South America, which never has bothered anybody. Where it was possible, unequal treaties were imposed, as in the Philippines. As for Western and Southern Europe, the popular forces of the resistance were broken, in part by force, and the Marshall Plan successfully reconstructed European capitalism. A highly sympathetic commentator described the goals of the program as follows: while there were humanitarian and economic justifications for the Marshall Plan, the strategic importance of keeping Western Europe out of the Soviet orbit was its ultimate, if not sole, justification. In strategic terms, the Marshall Plan represented a commitment of American resources to the protection of Western Europe against the expansion of Soviet influence and control. The Marshall Plan also laid the basis for the integration of much of the world economy, largely, though not wholly, on American terms. Japan was reconstructed as an industrial power with an essentially colonial hinterland. A good argument can be given in support of the analysis of critical Japanese commentators that Japan was to be developed not only as a military base against China and the Soviet Union, but also as an industrial base supporting the counter-revolutionary cause in Southeast Asia, a policy that was opposed not only by Russia, but also by virtually all the members of the Far Eastern Commission. The American hopes of dominating the system have received a setback because of the unexpected costs and failures of the Vietnam War. How significant this will be in the long run remains to be seen. The overriding goal of American policy has been to construct a system of societies that are open to free economic intervention by private enterprise, which in many ways is publicly subsidized. The goal was formulated clearly by George Bell, who urged a great unification of the world economy to give full play to the benefits of multinational corporations, which are a distinctly American development. Through such corporations, he observed, it has become possible for the first time to use the world's resources with maximum efficiency for the benefit of whom he does not reveal. It is hardly surprising that the world dominant power should oppose the resort to state controls by its weaker neighbors, or that it should speak of economic liberalism and the benefits of unifying the world economy. Nor is it surprising that others see the matter rather differently. Thus, a Tanzanian planner commented, "A country whose national development depends on foreign investments cannot adequately control its own destiny. It might succeed in attaining a successful takeoff, but its economy might be likened to an unmanned aircraft whose course and safety are maintained by remote controls. It is flying economy with no pilot aboard. The foreign investors who control it from a distance might decide to do anything with it." Words that might be spoken as well in South Korea, Canada, even England, and many other countries today. That such subservience creates and perpetuates unbalanced development, severe underdevelopment, has been demonstrated in many studies. Such effects do not pass unnoticed within the imperialist powers themselves. The political economy of American foreign policy, see Note 3, refers to some of the effects of economic liberalism and underdeveloped countries within this comment. With this comment. However, as the example of the United States suggests, this is probably not the way their resources would have been used had these countries been fully independent and had local enterprise existed capable of managing its own development. And Alfred Marshall, for one, observed, the brilliant genius and national enthusiasm of Listand, in contrast to the insular narrowness and self-confidence of the Ricardian school, for he showed that in Germany, still more in America, many of its indirect effects, free trade in the early 19th century, were evils, but by and large, the dominant world powers easily managed to construct a self-image of benevolence and rationality, the United States not excepted. The unification of the world economy by American-based multinational corporations poses a threat to national sovereignty, but more significantly to the possibility for social progress within even the more powerful societies. The problem is quite naturally of deep concern to organized labor. The head of one of Great Britain's largest unions, Hugh Scanlon, has recently discussed the power of international corporations to hamstring and browbeat the interests of organized labor. He cites Fortune magazine on the scale of these institutions. The hard financial core of capitalism is composed of not more than 60 firms, partnerships, or corporations owned or controlled by 1,000 men. In fact, recent forecasts claim that in 25 years, 200 multinational firms will completely dominate production and trade and account for over 75% of the total corporate assets of the capitalist world. The scale of these institutions is such, he writes, that they can obtain an overwhelming bargaining power within any government. Furthermore, their power and ability to transfer operations from one country to another can be used as a weapon against labor. As an example, he cites the recent Ford strike, when the threat to transfer operations from England to Belgium was used in exactly this way. Evidently, only an international labor organization with, as Scanlon emphasizes, real grassroots on the shop floor could begin to deal with this threat, which surely is severe. In the less developed countries, other means are employed to prevent balanced independent development. The imperial powers have consistently exploited and exacerbated ethnic rivalries and hostilities, and have tried to develop native elites that would control the local population while enriching themselves through their relations with the imperial power. Joseph de Castro observes that productive forces are strangled by the domination of alienated Western educated elites whose interests do not coincide with those of the disinherited masses. The goal of the imperial power is to create a class of bureaucrats and a colonial bourgeoisie that will collaborate in the administration and exploitation of the country. As Keith Buchanan points out, citing De Castro's remark, such elite groups today constitute one of the heaviest millstones around the necks of some of the emerging Southeast Asian peoples. Nominal political independence may have little or no effect on the independence underdevelopment caused by colonial dependence. Buchanan observes, in this prolongation of dependent and underdeveloped status, the new elites, the colonial bourgeoisie, created by the European restructuring of colonial societies, played an essential role. This, as we have seen, is a group which still profits by the exploitation of the colonial peoples, their fellow countrymen. This group, which now controls effective political power in Southeast Asia, has neither the vision nor, for obvious reasons, the desire to strike out and create, through the medium of planned societies based on humanistic socialism, a fuller and more autonomous life for their people. Only in Cambodia is there a dedicated attempt to follow this path. No more NC. And since these countries are now an area on which the conflict between the West and the Soviet bloc is projected, the whole military establishment of the West and its associated economic, cultural, and political mechanisms is used to buttress the elite groups who rule them. These groups are kept in power as a barrier against the changes the creation of a decent society would involve, against the changes for some reason fear, and the aid we give is used too often to create a Potemkin facade of prestige development. Bangkok or Kuala Lumpur offer classic examples of this, behind which the stagnation of the whole area continues. The social and economic effects of such tendencies in Southeast Asia are reviewed in a recent paper by two Yale University economists. Surveying the situation in the Philippines, Thailand, Malaya, and Singapore, they note the persistence of virtual stagnation in the hinterland in which the majority of people live, in contrast to the rapid growth of the metropolis Bangkok, Kuala Lumpur, and Manila. Widening inequality is also visible within metropoli in the form of industrial dualism and organized and heavily protected manufacturing sector coexist with a large craft sector where most of the urban people are employed or where there exists disguised unemployment. Despite political independence, there is increased dependency on the goods and the technology of the West. Many of the recently developed consumer goods industries are furthermore subsidiaries of multinational corporations. Economic policies favor consumer goods for the privileged, while a pool of cheap labor provides services for the middle and upper classes. While the country stagnates, the overcrowded cities decay behind the facade of wealth. A recent United Nations report notes that the conjunction of rapid population growth with widespread unemployment and family poverty has led to a further precipitous decline in urban living conditions, which in many large Asian cities have reached a stage of depression and disorder that practically defies description. To cite one illustrative example, in Bangkok, a superficially affluent metropolis of 3 million, most people have no sanitation facilities, while color television is now available throughout the country. Bangkok Bell and Resnick comment has become less and less part of Thailand and more part of the West. Of course, the process has been accelerated by the American use of Bangkok as a rest and recreation center for the Vietnam War, and Thailand in general as a sanctuary for the attack on the countries of Indochina. The corruption of Bangkok is, in fact, immediately evident even to the casual visitor. Furthermore, about half of the increase of the gross domestic product from 1965 to 1967 was attributable to military spending by the U.S. within Thailand, which has only further lopsided the pattern of development and incidentally led to considerable fears among the Thai elite concerning the future in the event of an American de-escalation of the war. Needless to say, the subservience to foreign interests breeds corruption on a vast scale. To cite just one example, the previously cited review of the Korean question by an anti-communist Korean journalist living in Japan maintains that the present Park administration had earned the worst reputation of any Korean government with regard to political corruption and injustice. Kim claims that a foreign credit of $10 million shrinks to $6 million before it becomes available for its intended purpose. 20% of the original amount goes to political funds, and another 20% disappears in bribes for government officials, from low echelon clerks up to ministers. The same observations hold for other less developed Asian countries that remain within the integrated world system of modern capitalism. The vested interest in American imperialism that is developing in such countries as Japan, South Korea, Thailand, and Singapore is also a potentially dangerous feature of modern American imperialism in Southeast Asia. American power modifies the social and economic structure of countries that become partners in its Asian wars and consequently threatens true independence in complex ways. Even the aid program that has this effect. In 1967, Michael Leifer notes, the urban elite of Cambodia, accustomed to a high standard of living sustained by American aid, is now finding it difficult to adjust to economic austerity caused by the termination of this program in 1963 on Sihanouk's initiative. Similarly, the termination of American military assistance led to disaffection among the military. This disaffection of the military and the urban elite was a contributing factor to the coup of March 18, 1970, which toppled Sihanouk and plunged Cambodia into a civil war in the Indochina War. See the comments by Kate Buchanan cited previously, page 11 in chapter 3. The American crusade against communism is in part an effort to prevent independent economic development, but as Joan Robinson also noted, it functions in other ways as well. It provides the psychological climate in which a continuing public subsidy can be provided in technologically advanced sectors of American industry for maintenance of a huge war machine. Only a population that fears for its survival can be induced or consent to this subsidy, which has become a central factor in the American post-war economy. This indeed was the primary economic lessons of World War II. New Deal measures had smoothed many of the rough edges of the Great Depression, but had not succeeded in bringing it to an end. The Depression was overcome by wartime government spending, and this lesson was not lost on those who own and manage the economy. Business historian Alfred Chandler describes the economic lessons of World War II as follows. The government spent far more than the most enthusiastic New Dealer had ever proposed. Most of the output of the expenditures was destroyed or left on the battlefields of Europe and Asia, but the resulting increased demand sent the nation into a period of prosperity the like of which has never before been seen. Moreover, the supply of huge armies and navies fighting the most massive war of all time required a tight centralized control of the national economy. This effort brought corporate managers to Washington to carry out one of the most complex pieces of economic planning in history. That experience lessened the ideologic fears over the government's role in stabilizing the economy. The ensuing Cold War, the crusade against communism, carried further the depoliticization of American society and created the psychological climate in which the government is able to intervene, in part through fiscal policies, public works, and public services, but very largely through war spending to preserve economic health. The government acts as a coordinator of last resort when managers are unable to maintain a high level of aggregate demand. Charles Wilson, president of General Electric, was undoubtedly motivated in part by a sense of economic realism when he proposed a permanent war economy in 1944. As another business historian writes, enlightened corporate managers, far from fearing government intervention in the economy, view the new economists as a technique for increasing corporate viability. And the primary technique of intervention is quite naturally war spending. Indeed, it is not easy, with the best of will, to imagine other forms of government induced production that will not harm but rather enhance the interest and power of the private empires that control the economy, that are endlessly expandable, and that will, at the same time, be tolerated by the mass of the population, which has to foot the bill. The managers of the publicly subsidized war industries are pleasingly frank about the matter. Bernard Nossiter has published a remarkable series of articles in which he reports a number of interviews with representatives of this system of militarized state capitalism. Samuel Downer, financial vice president of the LTV Aerospace Corporation, explained the following words why the post-Vietnam War world must be bolstered with military orders. It's basic. It's selling appeal in defense of the home. This is one of the greatest appeals the politicians have to adjusting the system. If you're the president and you need a control factor in the economy and you need to sell this factor, you can't sell Harlem and Watts, but you can sell self-preservation, a new environment. We're going to increase defense budgets as long as those bastards in Russia are ahead of us. The American people understand this. Of course, those bastards aren't exactly ahead of us in this deadly and cynical game, but that is only a minor embarrassment to the thesis. In times of need, it is always possible to call upon Dean Rusk, Hubert Humphrey, and other luminaries to warn of the billion Chinese armed to the teeth with setting out on world conquest. Many of the commentators have noted the dependence of the American economy on third world resources, particularly non-ferrous metals, as one factor in explaining the American crusade against independent national developments. These resources are required to a large extent for war production. Harry Magdoff notes that 3/4 of the imported materials included in the stockpile program come from the underdeveloped areas. He illustrates this dependence by an analysis of critical materials needed for jet engines. The strategic character of the materials is a factor, along with general considerations of profitability and control, in making the American government wary of trusting to trade relations with independent nations to acquire its needed raw materials. Military power is needed to control the empire. The empire is seen as a necessity to guarantee military power. Militarization of the economy is a primary factor in maintaining economic health. The threat of war, the constant danger of domestic insurgency in many parts of the world helps maintain the appropriate psychological climate of psychosis and conformism. Such mutually supporting factors create a system that is highly resistant to change, despite its irrationality and the costs it imposes on the citizenry. Almost 70% of taxes now are used to pay for the past, present, and future wars, not to speak of the threat to continued survival. So I'm going to make a short comment. So, basically in summary, this is the first 16 pages. We see basically the danger of American imperialism. Modern American imperialism is rather dangerous, like countries of Japan, South Korea, Thailand, and Singapore, because it modifies the social and economic structure of countries that become partners in its Asian wars. And so by modifying those structures, it can mass murder people in other countries and poses a huge threat to those other countries. So it is a very dangerous colonial group of white racist butchers. In addition, we discussed, many of the ideas, the white man's burden, the racist reasons for the war in Vietnam and Indochina. All of these things were, exact examples of why the U.S. government, likes to, murder the people and, enslave the people. We talked about colonial enslavement and capitalism, the way they enslave the people. A small group of bourgeoisie, maybe 5 or 6, Vietnamese in power with a lot of money, and then everybody under the whip and the machine gun. That's the American approach to imperialism. The same technique in Laos and the same technique in Cambodia. The machine gun keeps the peasants in check while the 3 or 4 people have all of the wealth, and they do the bidding to the imperialists. If the imperialists want to torture, individual peasants or communists, quote unquote, anyone with nationalist aspirations and wanting to control the birthright privileges, because it's natural that people want to control the birthright privileges, they stick it to them with machine guns. These are white racist, murderous American butchers. So continuing on, many commentators have noted the dependence of the American economy on third world resources, particularly non-ferrous metals, as one factor in explaining the American crusade against independent national development. The resources are required to a large extent for war production. Harry Magdoff notes that 3/4 of the imported material included in the stockpile program come from the underdeveloped areas. He illustrates this dependence by an analysis of critical materials needed for jet engines. The strategic character of the materials is a factor, along with general considerations of profitability and control, in making the American government wary of trusting to trade relations with independent nations to acquire its needed raw materials. Military power is needed to control the empire. The empire is seen as a necessity to guarantee military power. Militarization of the economy is a primary factor in maintaining economic health, quote unquote. The threat of war, the constant danger of domestic insurgency in many parts of the world help maintain the appropriate psychological climate of psychosis and conformism. Such mutually supporting factors create a system that is highly resistant to change despite its irrationality and the costs it imposes on the citizenry. Almost 70% of taxes now are used to pay for past, present, and future wars, not to speak of the threat to continued survival. The role of the Cold War in this system as a technique of domestic control should not be overlooked. Of course, Russian imperialism is not an invention of American ideologists. It is real enough, as the Hungarians and Czechs can testify. What is an invention is the uses to which was put, for example, by Dean Acheson in 1950 or Walt Rostow a decade or later, when they pretended that the Vietnam War was an example of Russian imperialism, or by the Johnson administration in 1965, when it justified the Dominican intervention with the reference to the Sino-Soviet military bloc, or by an entire generation of leaders who, as Townsend Hoops puts it, were conditioned by the tensions of the Cold War years, and thus could not perceive that the triumph of the national revolution in Vietnam would not be a triumph for Moscow and Peking. A most remarkable blindness on the part of literate men, or by Eugene Rostow, who in a recent book that was widely praised by American liberals, outlined the series of challenges to the world order by the modern era, Napoleon, Kaiser Wilhelm, Hitler, and continuing in the post-war world. Among others, general strikes in France and Italy, the civil war in Greece, and the attack on South Vietnam, where he writes, Russia has put us to severe tests in its effort to spread communism by the sword. One can continue indefinitely, to suggest that the Cold War is highly functional for the American elite, as well as for its Soviet counterpart, who in a familiar way sends its armies into Czechoslovakia to ward off Western imperialism. It serves to provide an ideology for empire and to mobilize support for the government-subsidized system of military state capitalism. It is predictable then that the opportunities to end the Cold War will be sidestepped, and the challenges to Cold War ideology will be bitterly resisted. In many ways, American society's indeed open and liberal values are preserved. However, as the poor and the black know well, the liberal veneer can be thin. Mark Twain once wrote, "It is by the goodness of God that in our country we have those three unspeakingly precious things: freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, and the prudence never to practice either of them. Those who lack the prudence may well pay the cost." A crucial element of the evolving post-war system is the increasing centralization of control in the economy and political life of the post-war world. A recent report by the staff of the Federal Trade Commission notes by the end of 1968, the 200 largest industrial corporations controlled over 60% of the total assets held by all manufacturing corporations. In 1941, the same amount of powers was spread over 1,000 corporations. The report notes further that the top 200 corporations are partially linked with one another and with other corporations in ways that may prevent or discourage independent behavior and market decisions. These corporations are furthermore increasingly becoming international in the scope of their operations. At the same time, in every parliamentary democracy, the role of parliament in policy formation is diminishing. The House Armed Services Committee describes the role of Congress as that of a sometimes querulous but essentially kind uncle who complains while furiously puffing on his pipe, but who finally, as everyone expects, gives in and hands over the allowance. Careful studies of civil military decisions show that this is an accurate perception. Harold Steen, professor of the Woodrow Wilson School of Princeton University, writes that since World War II, the basic determination of foreign military policy, of military expenditures and organization, and of weapons has been made by civilians in the executive branch, usually with the president in active control. Congress has exercised an occasionally restraining but never a guiding hand. Senator Arthur Vandenberg, 20 years ago, expressed his fear that the American chief executive would become the number one warlord of the earth. That has since occurred. The clearest example, perhaps, was President Johnson's decision to escalate the war in Vietnam in February 1965 in cynical disregard to the expressed will of the electorate. The recent invasion of Cambodia is a further step in this erosion of parliamentary power, so blatant that it has finally called forth significant gestures of senatorial opposition. These incidents reveal with perfect clarity the role of the public acting within through the parliamentary system in decisions about peace and war. Furthermore, these processes of centralization of control in economic and political life are closely related by virtue to the interpenetration of the executive branch of the government and the corporate elite. Richard Barnett cites in his study of the men who have set the framework of America's national security policy. Most of the top 400 decision makers, he writes, have come from executive suites and law offices within shouting distance of one another in 15 city blocks in New York, Washington, Detroit, Chicago, and Boston. In general, democratic decision making in a capitalist democracy is severely limited by the very fact that the commercial, financial, and industrial systems, the central institutions of the society, are in law and in principle excluded from public control or participation, except in the indirect ways in which any system of authority, no matter how autocratic, must be responsive to the public will. The tendencies toward concentration of power just noted and now commonly discussed further underscores the fundamental incompatibility of democracy and capitalism, particularly in the modern centralized form. The reliance of this system on production for war with the ideologic mobilization of the population is required. The paranoid fears that must be induced if the system is to be viable simply indicates the severity of the current American crisis, a world crisis given American power. The people of Indochina for 20 years have been the victims of American crisis. For 20 years, the United States has been attempting to maintain Western control over Indochina, first by support of the French, and then, when they proved inadequate to the task, through its own efforts. During this period, there have been many modifications of the tactics and even occasional television of goals as earlier hopes proved unrealizable. At first, there were recognizable and clearly presented material interests that motivated the American intervention in Indochina. I shall return to some of these later on. As time progressed and American involvement deepened, ideological factors became increasingly dominant. By now, a rational calculation of material interest and would presumably dictate that the United States abandon Indochina to its own people, and influential segments of the American corporate elite itself are urging that this venture be liquidated as bad business, if for no other reason. Unfortunately, the anti-communist crusade, so deeply rooted in the American system of post-war imperial state capitalism, cannot be turned on and off at will. Only a political leader of great courage and skill could extricate the United States from Indochina, even if the will were there. Hence, even if the dominant segments of American society decide that the war is no longer a paying proposition, there is no guarantee that they will be able to bring this particular case of anti-communist aggression to an end, and they are far from having reached this decision. It appears, even today, the hope remains that a military victory can be achieved if only domestic protest can be stilled. There is little indication of any change of strategy, though new tactics are being proposed to achieve the long-range goal of dominating Indochina. The original support for French imperialism was justified by the general ideology of anti-communism. Dean Akeson's State Department decided that Ho Chi Minh was acting as an agent of Soviet imperialism in 1950, thus showing a remarkable grasp of the realities of international affairs, a degree of insight demonstrated also by then Assistant Secretary of State Dean Rusk in his famous and often quoted remark that China in 1951 was a colonial Russian government, a Slavic Manchukuo on a large scale. It is not the government of China. It does not pass the first test. It is not Chinese. An official State Department document explained the United States government, convinced that neither national independence nor democratic evolution can exist in any areas dominated by Soviet imperialism, considered the situation to be such as to warrant its according economic aid and military equipment to the Associated States of Indochina, i.e. the French colonial government, and to France, in order to assist them in restoring stability and permitting these states to pursue their peaceful and democratic development. After Dien Bien Phu, the French were no longer able to maintain their effort. The Geneva Conference of 1954, so it appeared, established a sound and reasonable structure for the settlement of the affairs of Indochina on the basis of peace, independence, and neutrality. The United States, however, had other ideas. On May 3rd, 1954, he departed to the International Conference in Geneva. Secretary of State and racist white animal Dulles told the head of the French delegation, Jean Chauvel, that above all, the Red River and Mekong deltas must be held in order to prepare for the coming counterattack in 2 years' time. Throughout Dulles' attitude was quite negative. He strongly opposed the proposed neutralization of Laos and Cambodia and appears to have tried to sabotage the negotiations. Anthony Eden understood his attitude as follows. As I reported to London at this time, the Americans seemed clearly apprehensive of reaching any agreement, however innocuous, with the communists. Chauvel gave the following description of American intentions. The Americans can only accept the Geneva agreements provisionally. They have reconciled themselves to respecting them during the stated 2-year period until the elections are held. That is, during these 2 years, they will react to any communist venture directed against the state of affairs defined in the agreements. But they are in no way prepared to let things take their course when the time comes. As far as they are concerned, the general elections must be prevented by means of any excuse whatsoever. The only purpose of the Geneva agreements, as they see them, is to provide a cover for the political, economic, and military preparations for the conquest. In May, Dulles throughout the preparations would take 2 years. This reconquest must be achieved, if not through war, then at least for the threat of war. Therefore, the pact must create an international force designed either to wage war well or make the threat of war effective. Dulles' innovations are outlined by Walter Lefebvre in a recent summary of development of American policy in Indochina. We became involved in Indochina 20 long years ago, not because we were primarily concerned about that area, but because we were concerned about two other problems. These two problems were Japan and Western Europe. But we were concerned about Japan because we wanted the Japanese to become, over a period of time, the bulwark against revolutions in communist China. In 1950, we negotiated a security pact between Japan, between 1950 and 1954, a series of intelligent, persuasive statements by Eisenhower and John Foster Dulles emphasized that Southeast Asia was important to the United States because Southeast Asian markets were important to Japanese industrial growth. Without a viable pro-West Japan, there could be no effective containment of Asian communism. In a private meeting of the Council of Foreign Relations in October 1950, Dulles, then a key State Department policymaker, argued that Japan must either exploit and open Southeast Asia or else she would turn towards her traditional markets in China. Because of the American determination to isolate China, such Sino-Japanese relations could not be tolerated. Southeast Asia would have to remain open. In 1954, Indochina continued to be regarded by Dulles, now Secretary of State, as of importance in the overall Asiatic picture whose focus was Japan. The European policy was changed slightly. Indochina became important because the manner in which we maintained anti-communist forces there would demonstrate our commitment to the containment policy in Europe. Thus, the American policy in Indochina was seen as a central component in American global strategy. A few years ago, Lefebvre observed that when Eisenhower announced his falling dominoes theory on April 7, 1954, he referred specifically to Japan. Communist success in Indochina takes away in its economic aspects that region that Japan must have a trading area, or Japan in turn will have only one place in the world to go, that is toward the communist areas in order to live. So the possible consequences of the loss are just incalculable to the free world. Lefebvre added this thesis became a controlling assumption. The loss of Vietnam would mean the economic undermining and probable loss of Japan to communist markets and ultimately to communist influence, if not control. The similar concerns were voiced in 1955 by the prestigious study group cited earlier. This report observes Japanese industry has long since outgrown its meager domestic resource base and must find expanding overseas sources of food, fuel, and industrial materials, which can be purchased with expanding exports of manufacturers. In the interwar period, the Japanese industrialists threw in their lot with militarists in an effort to solve the problem through imperialism. Today, the same problem faces them again in a much aggravated form. The Japanese economy has now shorn of its protected colonial markets, investment outlets, and food and raw material sources, and its trade with the Chinese mainland has been reduced to a trickle. The last reference is perhaps a bit disingenuous. There is reason to believe that American pressure was a factor in the reduction of the China trade. A recent study by Chitoshi Yanaga observes, at a closed regional meeting of American ambassadors in Asia in early March 1955, Secretary of State Dulles outlined American diplomatic strategy, a major goal of which was to develop markets for Japan and Southeast Asia in order to counteract communist trade efforts and to promote trade between Japan and Southeast Asian countries. This was the culmination of a series of discussions over the preceding year, which, in Yanaga's words, endorsed the view that in the execution of Japan's plan of economic cooperation, the United States and the countries of Southeast Asia were inseparably tied to Japan. The study group continues as follows. The history of the 1930s should be a warning to the West, and especially to the United States, that failure to make sufficient economic opportunity for the expansion of Japan's exports and for Japanese economic growth can be disastrous for the security of the West and the peace of the world. The logical way to open this opportunity would be to make possible greater Japanese participation in the development of Southern Asia. Elsewhere, the report notes that the concern of the United States for the expanding sources of primary products and increasing the markets for industrial exports in the underdeveloped countries is primarily a function of our political and military concern that the economic health and military strength of Western Europe and Japan. These industrial economies can enjoy adequate rates of growth only if they can achieve a rapid and sustained increase of industrial imports and primary imports at satisfactory terms of trade. Correspondingly, spokesmen for the less developed countries continually point out that the deterioration of the terms of the trade, from their point of view, is a major factor in perpetuating their underdevelopment. Of course, these discussions of political and economic advantages for the industrial societies and how to guarantee them are also spiced liberally with references to the humane and civilized goals of the West, whose institutions express, however imperfectly, those universal ideals of human freedom, individual worth, and economic and social justice, which the middle classes of the underdeveloped countries may yet come to value as much as, if not more than, material progress. Meanwhile, the aim of economic activity in the West is the maximization of money income in one or another of its forms by individual through the investment of capital or of labor on one's own account and for and under the direction of others. The realization of these ideals is threatened in many ways by collectivist totalitarianism, by the British excessively egalitarian pattern of income distribution, excessive, that is, from the standpoint of savings, labor incentives, and labor mobility, by irrational communist-inspired land redistribution in Guatemala under Arbenz, by the nationalistic totalitarian or crypto-communist regimes, which nearly succeeded in consolidating their rule in such countries as Iran and Guatemala in the early 1950s, and so on. Still, there is every possibility that the mill hands of Calcutta, the peasants of Egypt, and the Indians of Guatemala can become politically more reliable and economically more cooperative members of the free world community, exercising the capacity for self-control, for rational and morally valid choices, and for responsible actions under the guidance of native elites, which the United States will establish and support, and under the active leadership of the United States, which can no longer merely play the role of infrequent and impartial arbiter in international affairs. Although the Indochina War in part develops through its own dynamics, the president, as noted earlier, is hardly likely to be willing to face the domestic political consequences of an American defeat. Even if the alternative is possible global war, it may be that the controlling assumption that Lefebvre persuasively identified remains an important factor in accounting for the persistence of the American effort to control Southeast Asia. Returning in 1950 to 1954 after the Geneva Conference, the United States quickly seized control of South Vietnam, eliminating British and French influence and establishing the deemed dictatorship, which in a sense still persists. As the Indian diplomat B.S.N. Murthy of the International Control Commission put it, in September 1954, it was the United States, not the Vietnamese people, who decided that Ngo Dinh Diem would continue to be president of South Vietnam. With substantial American assistance and liberal use of force and terror, Diem succeeded in imposing his rule and subverting the Geneva Agreements while rejecting all diplomatic efforts and blocking even minimal contacts with North Vietnam. By 1959, the situation was such that a high American official in Saigon would report, "The Viet Minh can make a strong case that the United States is effectively replacing France as the new master of Free Vietnam." Meanwhile, the United States created the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. Its principal purpose, according to Dulles, was to provide a president legal authority to intervene in Indochina. Efforts to bring Cambodia into the American anti-communist alliance were unavailing. Cambodia's American-supported neighbors, South Vietnam and Thailand, blockaded the Cambodian coast and carried out border incursions in the late 1950s and attempted, probably with American aid, to overthrow Sihanouk in 1959, but without success. In Laos, however, American subversion succeeded in toppling the coalition government and finally imposing the regime of the military dictator Phumino Savan in 1959, recapitulating what the United States had achieved in Thailand a decade earlier. However, the consequences in Laos were so appalling from the point of view of the American government that it undertook a new approach in 1961 and joined in the Second Geneva Conference, which in 1962 established the basis for neutralization of Laos and the formation of a new government of national union. This coalition once again collapsed. The Royal Lao government and the Pathet Lao have traded accusations as to the cause, and there is much that remains unclear. By 1964, a new civil war was underway, with the United States supporting the Royal Lao government and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam supporting the Pathet Lao. In Vietnam, the succession of American-supported regimes had by 1965 lost the war in province after province to local South Vietnamese resistance forces, which the Americans call Viet Cong, including South Vietnamese who returned from North Vietnam after the final breakdown of the Geneva Agreements from 1959, according to the American government sources. Since even the vast American support efforts of the early 1960s were unavailing, the United States sent what amounted to an occupying army in 1965 and subsequent years, and began the intensive and regular bombardment of North and South Vietnam in early 1965. The first North Vietnamese units were detected in South Vietnam in April 1965, according to the Pentagon. George Cahin summarizes the events of this period as follows. Any dispassionate examination of the relevant data makes clear that insurrectionary activity against the Saigon government is Southern rooted, began in the South and at Southern initiative in response to Southern demands. It commenced not as a consequence of any dictate from Hanoi, but in fact was initially contrary to Hanoi's injunctions. The NLF finally gave political articulation and leadership to an already advanced and well-developed widespread reaction to the South against the harshness and heavy-handedness of Diem's Saigon government. It represented an assertion of leadership by Southern Viet Minh veterans no longer willing to accept the restraint so long urged by Hanoi. It is useful to note that although American government propaganda invariably speaks of quote-unquote aggression from the North, the documentary evidence presented by American officials and academic advisors is entirely in support of Cahin's summary, and in fact, these same individuals generally concede as much in more technical discussions. The Tet Offensive of January 1968 led to a reassessment of American strategy. To some influential policymakers, it indicated that the strategy of military victory was not feasible. Undersecretary of the Air Force Townsend Hoops drafted a memorandum in March 1968 in which he concluded, anything resembling a clear-cut military victory in Vietnam appears possible only at the price of destroying SVN, tearing apart the social and political fabric of our own country, alienating our European friends, and gravely weakening the whole free world structure of relations, of alliances. The point of view had a certain influence, but was not adapted. Hoops put it as follows: military victory had been foreclosed both by the events and the decisions of March 31st, yet half the government, tacitly encouraged by the president, continued its ardent pursuit. And because military victory was not firmly put aside as an unreality, the idea of an independent South Vietnam, free of communist influence, continued to circulate in the influential places as a valid and viable objective of U.S. policy. Until October, when Clifford, Harriman, and Vance succeeded in bringing off a total bombing halt, the bombing effort was not really curtailed, but only geographically rearranged. Statistically, there was an intensification. It would have been more accurate to say that in October, the bombing effort was also geographically rearranged and was again intensified. The planes released from the bombardment of North Vietnam were shifted to Laotian targets and bombing, including heavy bombardment of civilian targets in northern Laos, reached its highest peak of the war in early 1969 under Lyndon Johnson. It is useful to recall as well the American reaction in South Vietnam to the termination of the regular bombing of the North and the opening of negotiations in Paris in November 1968. Douglas Robinson quoted the military sources that outlined plans to use the warplanes freed from daily missions over North Vietnam for increased airstrikes to support ground actions in the South. Moreover, in the Gulf of Tonkin, American warships began to steam toward positions off the coast of South Vietnam. Military leaders said that the battleship New Jersey and the other cruisers and destroyers that had been used to bombard the North Vietnamese coast would now be used for military operations in the South. As was reported shortly after, but the most cynical aspects of American military planning was indicated in the extremely important gain anticipated by the Allied military command. If the North Vietnamese do not try to build up their forces as a result of the bombing halt, at least a division of American troops would be free to carry out an operation, long though necessary, by the military, the ferreting out of Viet Cong leaders and cadres in the communist-dominated villages and hamlets around South Vietnam. Thus, if the communists show their sincerity by restricting their military activities in the South, we reciprocate by using our military forces to eradicate the political and administrative structure of the National Liberation Front, to deprive it of what the South Vietnamese Prime Minister Tran Van Do had earlier described as a political way to take over South Vietnam, namely the integration of the front in its acceptance as a political party. Sure disaster for the Saigon regime, which professed itself, then as now, to be unable to organize South Vietnam politically. General Abrams explained the matter clearly to his senior commanders. The North Vietnamese personnel and units are totally dependent for their existence as well as their military operations on the political, administrative, and paramilitary structure. It is this indigenous South Vietnamese structure on which his whole movement depends. So you should go out and work against them and find them. The proper goal for the American Army of Occupation. The United States Military Command quickly reported some measure of success and improvement in the kill ratio attributed to the pressure being maintained by Allied forces, which were seeking to attack the North Vietnamese Viet Cong system in South Vietnam. The New York Times on November 23, 1968, cited Allied officials as pointing out that a decade in the activity of regular enemy forces logically leads to an increase in Allied activity against guerrillas, and particularly against the Viet Cong infrastructure, which is where so much of it really starts. The report describes an operation in which 3,000 civilians were evacuated and painstakingly screened by intelligence officer, 100 enemy forces dead, about a dozen suspected Viet Cong identified. On a facing page, the Time quotes President Johnson: "We cannot have productive talks in an atmosphere where the cities are being shelled and where the DMZ are being abused." On December 14, 1968, the New York Times commented editorially on the fact that since the bombing halt, the enemy has initiated only one battalion-sized assault, while by comparison last month, American troops mounted 63 battalion operations and South Vietnam staged 664 such campaigns in an effort to extend South Vietnamese government control over disputed areas and territory long controlled by the Viet Cong. I.F. Stone checked these figures with the Pentagon. They were not challenged and discovered further that the tempo of offensive operations from our side had gone up about 25% in December and October over November. The number of actions initiated by the enemy was classified for reasons unexplained, though hardly obscure. With the advent of the Nixon administration, accelerated pacification had been continued in this manner. Surely the Vietnamese or the American people would have to be naive to the point of near imbecility to put any faith in the good intentions of the American government. In fact, the cynicism of the American response to the opportunities for the peace in 1968 merely recapitulates in another form a reaction to the Geneva of 1954. The record is quite clear that the Viet Minh, the forces that had fought and defeated the French, accepted the Geneva Accords in good faith and made a serious effort to initiate discussions that would lead to the elections promised in 1956. The American instituted regime in the South took advantage of this naivete to institute an extensive repression in which thousands were killed and tens of thousands were imprisoned. By 1959, a good part of the former Viet Minh political structure had been wiped out. In contrast, there were apparently very few cases of political reprisal in the North, nor has the American government or its Saigon subsidiary made any specific claim to the contrary. For details, see the references cited above and many other sources. In the elections of 1967, neither communists nor neutralists whose activists might be interpreted by the government as sympathetic to the communists were permitted to participate. Since then, repression has proceeded unabated. Under the circumstances, the National Liberation Front, now the Provincial Revolutionary Government of South Vietnam, can certainly not accept any solution, ceasefire, or some election formula that leaves control of the South in the hands of the Saigon authorities. This would amount to suicide, literally. Thus, all of the formulas that have been proposed, however vaguely, by the United States in the Paris negotiations are totally unacceptable, since all, in one form or another, require that the Viet Cong lay down their arms, trusting to the good intentions of the Saigon government and the butchers of murder of the United States, an obvious absurdity. Since the curtailment of the regular bombing of North Vietnam in November 1968, the United States has further escalated the war in Laos, both on the ground and in the air, and has recently invaded Cambodia. At the time of the Nixon inaugural, the U.S. News and World Report, January 27, 1969, reported that those most deeply involved in overall strategy foresee a slow reduction of United States forces in Vietnam to 200,000 men by the end of 1971 as the basis for a long-haul, low-effort in Vietnam that could continue indefinitely. Since that time, the American Expeditionary Force in South Vietnam has been reduced to below 500,000 men, and there is talk of further withdrawals. From the rather vague reports from Washington, it appears that the present intention is to leave a force of perhaps 250,000 American soldiers, along with approximately 70,000 troops that the United States has brought in from South Korea, Thailand, Australia, and New Zealand, operating from a huge American bases in South Vietnam and supported by the Pacific Naval and Air Command with its sanctuaries scattered from Thailand to Okinawa. There is no indication that the intense bombardment of Indochina will be any way reduced or that efforts will be made to reach a political settlement. On the contrary, it is likely that the technological warfare will intensify since it involves few American casualties and is therefore felt to be tolerable at home. A fair estimate is that military and subsequent political victory, in the sense described by Hoop, see Note 73, continue to be the aim of American policy. However, the United States, despite its formidable military resources, does not dominate the situation. The war has now expanded over all of Indochina. The United States finds itself sustaining regimes in South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia that can command little domestic support. A Viet-Lao-Khmer alliance of popular liberation forces is in the formation, backed strongly by China. the war may spread to other areas of Southeast Asia. In particular, the United States can hardly hope to continue to use Thailand as a privileged sanctuary for its Indochina war, as it has been doing since early 1964, without a response from the peoples whom it is attacking. Thailand now has troops engaged in South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, in part for counterinsurgency training under American guidance, but in part, no doubt, because of the guerrilla threat that results from its use as an American sanctuary, and that intensifies as it sends troops to help combat insurgency in the countries of Indochina. The current situation is outlined in a recent report from Bangkok as the Thais see it. Eastern frontiers in danger. On the maps, all the frontiers situated to the east of the country today are bordered with red, the red of the guerrillas, all along the Mekong. All along the Mekong, which for almost 700 kilometers borders the country, the army faces incursions from guerrillas coming from Laos. In the north, operations continue against guerrilla forces that maintain at present a close cooperation with the Lao fighters of the Red Prince Suphanavogong. Bangkok has replied by sending its own advisors to aid the Royal Lao Army. To the south, the pro-Chinese guerrillas operate on both sides of the Malaysian frontier. The Thai and Malaysian armies carry out coordinated operations against them, but it is in the frontier of Cambodia which may pose the greatest dangers. Bangkok is only 200 kilometers from Cambodia, and the fall of Prince Sihanouk and precipitating pro-communist troops of several origins, Vietnamese Cambodians, into the interior of Cambodia has opened to, quote, subversion, the vast plains drained by the Menem and the tributaries of the Mekong. The American bases are also menaced, the report continues. Not only the air bases at Udorn and Uban, not far from the Laotian border, but also the great aeronaval base at Sattahip, which is only about 100 miles from Cambodia. UPI reports that Thailand has put its forces on full alert along the Cambodian border, where General Prapaz Charosithian, commander of the Thai army, describes the situation as serious. The presence of communist troops in Cambodia, he says, represents the biggest threat of Thailand's security, the security of the Thai elite in the past 50 years. Moreover, a Chinese-built all-weather highway under construction in northern Laos, said to be protected by Chinese troops and anti-aircraft, may someday be used for support of Thai guerrillas or even direct invasion if the United States should escalate again elsewhere. In the far north of Thailand, near the border of Laos and Burma and not far from China, an American battalion recently arrived from Vietnam is reported to be constructing a jungle road to the border of Hin Teek in an area where 3,000 to 4,000 nationalist Chinese are said to be operating, fighting communists, guarding the frontier, protecting the opium caravans, and sending spies and commandos into southern China. From the far north of the Gulf to the Gulf of Siam, the Thai border is likely to be increasingly troubled and the Thai elite threatened by its rule of the country that has been for years America's major base for its Southeast Asian wars. Furthermore, American provocation of China has been serious. To cite just the most dramatic case, from 1965 to 1968, the air war against North Vietnam was in part directed against internal Chinese communication lines, namely the rail and road connections that were the sole connection between southwestern China and the rest of China, and that happened to pass through North Vietnam near Hanoi. If the United States were to escalate to the point where the destruction of the Pathet Lao, the National Liberation Front, the Sihanouk government, and its emerging local army, and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam appeared likely, direct Chinese intervention might follow. The Soviet Union, though unlikely to intervene in force in Indochina, might well react elsewhere in an effort to maintain its prestige and authority, perhaps in the Middle East, where a highly inflammatory situation persists. It is quite possible that the present and projected level of American involvement in the Indochina War, the American position may suddenly collapse or slowly erode. In the past, perceived threats have led to highly erratic behavior on the part of the white butchers of the American government. Fred Sherman has recently commented on this recurrent pattern. The air war over Laos began on May 17, 1964, after a crisis of little more than a day caused by the fall of a minuscule Laotian town called Tha Thom, apparently but not really to the Pathet Lao. The most notorious and sudden decision of all was the Tonkin Gulf. Hardly had the conflicting reports on the second clash with North Vietnamese PT boats come to Washington that the word went out to launch massive airstrikes against North Vietnam. The most critical escalation of all, the February 7th air attack on North Vietnam, which launched the bombing war, was decided on within 12 hours of the Viet Cong attack on Pleiku. Other examples might be cited. Jonathan Mirsky and Stephen Stonefield give a detailed discussion of one incident, which they summarize as follows. After a CIA-sponsored Lao leader provoked a clash during the 1962 Geneva ceasefire, the Kennedy administration seriously considered a nuclear attack on the Chinese mainland, although its own military observers on the scene reported no foreign troops engaged other than American special forces. So you can see the U.S. government, the racist butchers of the U.S. government, the murderous gangsters of Washington, they considered a nuclear attack on China for a simple conflict in Vietnam in which they were trying to force enslavement, slavery. These are white racist, murderous American butchers. One recalls the Cuban Missile Crisis of the same year when the Kennedy administration was willing to face what it considered an extremely high risk of nuclear war in order to establish the principle that we have the right to maintain missiles on the Russian border, obsolete missiles which had already been ordered withdrawn, unknown to the Russians, but that they do not have the equivalent right. Thus, Khrushchev's offer that all these missiles should be withdrawn provoked highly irrational reactions and was rejected. It is not unlikely that the Nixon administration might be led to desperate measures, particularly if domestic turmoil and loss of confidence continue, along with the internal economic crisis that is closely related to the Indochina War. Speculating about this possibility, Richard Barnett warns, quite plausibly, of the danger that the United States government might resort to the use of nuclear weapons. He points out that of 1968, there were 5,500 nuclear weapons in the Southeast Asian area, and recalls some of President Nixon's earlier pronouncement, for example, the following. The weapons which were used during the Korean and World War II are obsolete. Our artillery and our tactical air force in the Pacific are now equipped with atomic explosives, which can and will be used on military targets with precision and effectiveness. It is foolish to talk about the possibility that the weapons which might be used in the event war breaks out in the Pacific would be limited to the conventional Korean and World War II types of explosives. Our forces could not fight an effective war in the Pacific and with those types of explosives if they wanted to. Tactical atomic explosives are now conventional and will be used against military targets of any aggressive force. The president is not alone in such recommendations. To cite a further example, Hanson Baldwin, military commentator for the New York Times, has urged that in the post-Vietnam era, we be prepared to escalate technologically rather than with manpower as we bolster movements under attack and secure them against creeping communism. Such escalation suggests might involve the use of small nuclear devices for definitive purposes. Particularly interesting is the concept of defensive purposes as we bolster a weak government against creeping communism. Surely no rational or realistic person will discount the possibility that the United States might suddenly resort to nuclear weapons. Those who retain the instinct for survival, not to speak of minimal concern for their fellow man, will seek ways to act before rather than after the event. Okay, we're in section 3. The American war in Indochina has been based on two principles: physical destruction in areas that are beyond the reach of American troops, and the use of what are euphemistically called population control measures, quote unquote, in areas that can be occupied by American forces or the forces that they train, supply, advise, and provide with air and artillery support. Since 1959, forced relocation has been undertaken to concentrate the population. Population removal through defoliation began in 1961, according to one Vietnamese witness. Long reports that it proved easier to order flyers to spray crops from the air than to send in ground troops to force the people out by setting fire to the fields and houses. Later population removal was carried out largely by air and artillery bombardment, particularly after the establishment of vast free fire zones. To put the matter in the simplest and most dispassionate terms, massacre and forced evacuation of the peasantry, combined with rigorous control over those forced under American rule, is the essence of American strategy in Vietnam. The facts are easily established and the reasons are also fairly clear. There is no other technique that can be effective against a people's war. The reasons for the success of the people's war are also not obscure. Years ago, the strongly anti-communist Australian reporter Dennis Warner, who knows Southeast Asia well, observed that in hundreds of villages all over Southeast Asia, the only people working at the grassroots for an uplift of the people's living standard are the communists. In his judgment, this is a monstrous trick, but his judgment does not seem to be shared by the peasants of Vietnam. United States government documents suffice to show the effects of this grassroots work, which forced the United States to resort to violence and terror. Observing the American response to the People's War, one recalls once that, again, the Philippine campaign at the turn of the century. For example, when President Theodore Roosevelt gave orders to pacify Samar, General Jake Smith ordered that Samar be transformed into a howling wilderness, quote unquote. I want no prisoners, he ordered. I wish you to kill and burn. The more you burn and kill, the better it will please me. For a clear explanation of the theory behind American strategy in Vietnam, one can turn to an important essay by Professor Samuel Huntington, chairman of the Department of Government at Harvard University and chairman of the Council on Vietnamese Studies of the Southeast Asian Development Advisory Group, CDAG. He writes, in an absent-minded way, the United States and Vietnam may well have stumbled upon the answer to wars of national liberation. The answer to such wars is forced draft urbanization and modernization, which rapidly brings the country in question out of the phase in which a rural revolutionary movement can hope to generate sufficient strength to come to power. He presents a more detailed description of the answer we have stumbled upon in a comment on Sir Robert Thompson's contention that People's Revolutionary War is immune to the direct application of mechanical and conventional power. This Professor Huntington denies. In the light of the recent event, the statement needs to be seriously qualified. For if the direct application of mechanical and conventional power takes place on such a massive scale as to produce a massive migration from countryside to city, the basic assumptions underlying the Maoist doctrine of revolutionary war no longer operate. The Maoist-inspired rural revolution is undercut by the American-sponsored urban revolution. He also notes that the Viet Cong remains a powerful force which cannot be dislodged from its constituency so long as the constituency continues to exist, quote unquote. These comments, no doubt accurate, provide a succinct explanation for American strategy. Since the Viet Cong is a powerful force which cannot be dislodged from its constituency so long as the constituency continues to exist, the United States command has resorted to military force, causing the migration of the rural population to refugee camps and urban slums where it is hoped the Viet Cong constituency can be properly controlled. No sentimentalist, Huntington expresses no qualms, no judgment at all about the methods, which clearly involve war crimes as defined by the Nuremberg Principle 6, for example. His approach follows the principle enunciated by two counterinsurgency theorists recently. All the dilemmas of counterinsurgency are practical and as neutral in an ethical sense as the laws of physics. Thus, Huntington uses such terms as urbanization to refer to the process by which we drive the Viet Cong constituency into refugee camps and sites, and he speaks of the American-sponsored urban revolution, the quote-unquote social revolution that we have brought about in this way. So successful is urbanization, he might have added, that the population density of Saigon is now estimated at more than twice that of Tokyo. Lucky for the Vietnamese. After describing how we may have stumbled upon the answers to peasant revolutions, Huntington adds this paragraph. Time in South Vietnam is increasingly on the side of the government, but in the short run, with half the population still in the countryside, the Viet Cong will remain a powerful force which cannot be dislodged from its constituency so long as the constituency continues to exist. Peace in the immediate future must hence be based on accommodation. Obviously, if the Viet Cong constituency will continue to exist in the short run, it follows that in the immediate future, if there is to be peace, it must be based on accommodation or American withdrawal, which is rejected as misplaced moralism. This is not a policy proposal, but rather, indubitably, an immediate consequences of the assumption that the Viet Cong will remain a powerful force. Why this assumption, Huntington explains. To eliminate the Viet Cong control in these areas would be an expensive, time-consuming, and frustrating task. It would require a much larger and more intense military and pacification effort than is currently contemplated by Saigon and Washington. Since the answer to wars of national liberation will, in this instance, require an effort that is expensive, time-consuming, and frustrating, and since Saigon and Washington cannot or will not take necessary steps, evidently another approach must be sought. Therefore, Huntington proposes that the Viet Cong accept an arrangement rather like that of the Ho How, who he asserts went through the typical evolution, development of social and political consciousness, confrontation with the central government, defeat by the central government, withdrawal from the national political scene, and accommodation. Given the present rates of urbanization and of modernization, his prognosis is that the Viet Cong could now degenerate into the protest of a declining rural minority, increasingly dependent upon outside support, though at one time prior to urbanization and modernization, the Viet Cong had the potential for developing into a truly comprehensive revolutionary force with an appeal to both rural and urban groups. Suppose, however, the NLF refuses to be satisfied with the generous offer of some degree of local control within the framework of national power set by the United States military and the Saigon authorities it has installed. Suppose that the NLF is unwilling to accept an accommodation under which it is likely to degenerate into a declining rural minority. Then Mr. Huntington explains we can make it clear that this confrontation cannot succeed. He does not list the methods, but they can easily be imagined. Thus, although the general answer to peasant revolution may be beyond our grasp in the short run, given present political realities, we may still be able to impose by force a, quote, accommodation that is likely to lead to the political solution that we have determined to be appropriate. Nothing could indicate more clearly the persistence of what can only be described as colonialist assumptions, pragmatically attuned to the political and economic constraints within which policymakers are forced to operate. Huntington illustrates his premises further in some remarks about the Dominican intervention of 1965. In evaluating an intervention, he explains, results are all that count. Thus, the Dominican intervention appears to have been a success, even in the eyes of those who felt in 1965 that there were no good political or moral grounds whatsoever for intervening in the Dominican Republic. Why? Because whether or not there was a threat of communist takeover on the island, we were able to go in, restore order, negotiate a truce among conflicting parties, hold reasonably honest elections, which the right man won, withdraw our troops, and promote a very considerable amount of social and economic reform. Thus, the intervention was consistent with the general purposes of methods of intervention, namely the attempt to, quote, minimize violence and instability in foreign countries, though not, of course, to minimize the kind of violence carried out by our friends in Indonesia, where hundreds of thousands were massacred, or the kind we and our allies perpetrate in Vietnam, nor to support the kind of stability we find in North Vietnam, which is probably the most stable government in Southeast Asia. A bitter truth, but a real one, according to Professor Huntington. Similarly, in Vietnam, if all goes well, we may ultimately be able to cope with the problems of urbanization or to reverse the process. After the war, massive government programs will be required either to resettle migrants in rural areas or to rebuild the cities and promote peacetime urban employment. And with luck, we may be able to arrange matters so that the right man wins in a reasonably honest election. Meanwhile, we continue absent-mindedly to contribute to the theory and practice of political development by artillery and aerial bombardment in the rural areas. As Huntington explains it, we thereby help the GVN to bridge the gap to the countryside, for which it is divorced by induction, substantial migration of people from the countryside to the cities, and by promoting economic development. The problem of lack of resolve on the home front touched upon by Professor Huntington in the comments quoted above has concerned other governments' advisors as well. Thus, Huntington colleague Professor Ithiel Poole, then chairman of the Department of Political Science at MIT, and a Defense Department consultant who also directs research on pacification and urban insurgency, discussed the interrelation of Vietnam policy and domestic attitudes at the Stevens Institute conference, of which I have already referred. Poole observes that our worst mistake in Vietnam clearly was to initiate bombing of the North. The explanation is interesting. Before that started, it was my view that the United States as a democracy could not stand the moral protest that would arise if we rained death from the skies upon an area where there was no war. After the bombing started, I decided I had been in error. For a while, there seemed to be no outcry of protest, but time brought it on. Now I would return to my original view with an important modification, namely time. Public reactions do not come immediately. Many actions that public opinion would otherwise make impossible are possible if they are short term. If we believe we can fairly say that unless it is severely provoked, or unless war succeeds fast, democracy cannot choose war as an instrument of policy. This is spoken in the tone of a true scientist, correcting a few of the variables that entered into his computations. And to be sure, Professor Poole is scornful of those anti-intellectuals such as Senator Fulbright, who do not comprehend the vital importance of applied social science for making the actions of our government in foreign areas more rational and humane than they have been. In contrast to the anti-intellectuals, the applied social science understands that it is perfectly proper to rain death from the skies upon an area where there was no war, so long as we succeed fast. If victory is delayed, the cohesion of the democratic community will be destroyed by the choice of war as an instrument of policy. Furthermore, we cannot abandon this instrument of policy, for we must come to realize that we can live safely only in a world in which the political system of all states are democratic and pacifically oriented like ours. Though it would be preferable to influence political outcomes without the use of force, we must continue to be ready to cope with dangerous armed ideologies, as in Vietnam at least, until the various aspects of our value systems, in particular Pacific orientation, spread more widely throughout the world. So I'm going to make a comment here. Let's go back to Professor Huntington, Samuel Huntington of Harvard University, chairman at Harvard University. Mr. Huntington says that, the way we can, stop the Viet Cong is to destroy the constituency. His statement was basically, you must destroy the constituency, a powerful force which cannot be dislodged from its constituency so long as the constituency continues to exist. So what was Mr. Huntington's, suggestion? It was genocide. It was to, destroy the constituency, obliterate the constituency with bombing. And that is what he suggested. This is the Harvard department chairman suggesting a genocide in Indochina, a racist American white fraud and butcher of the United States government, an agent of the racist white vigilante butchers of the U.S., murderous butchers of the United States of America. And then we continue to Ithiel Poole. Again, Ithiel Poole making the statement that, you have to rain down bombs if you can succeed fast. The idea is the Department of Defense is successful if you rain down bombs in the sky, and in, a couple weeks, you're done. You've destroyed it. It didn't happen in Indochina. So obviously Ithiel Poole had to retract his ideas and say that, well, it didn't work. And so it was a mistake. So obviously another racist, murderous American white butcher. So continuing on, it would seem to follow then that our failure in Vietnam is traceable to a serious inadequacy in our own political system, its inability to contain the moral outrage that resulted when we began to rain death on a country where there was no war. This is precisely the conclusion reached by Professor Poole, who is not short on logic. We are paying an inordinate price for our goals, and in that sense, we certainly have failed, but more in the United States than in Vietnam. The agonizing political lesson that racks this country is that there has been a failure of our own political system. The performance of our political system has been disappointing and gloomy, but not too gloomy, since there is no evidence that either the government or the majority of the public are ready to withdraw abruptly in disarray from Vietnam. Our system has proved incapable of dealing with the intensity of dissent, quote unquote, which, along with all other factors, threatens domestic stability. These are the failings of which we usually accuse the Vietnamese, but the criticism is more fairly addressed against ourselves. In short, a democratic community is incapable of waging aggressive war in a brutal manner, and this is a failure of democracy. What is wrong is not the policy of raining death on an area where there is no war, still less the far more intensive bombardment of South Vietnam, which goes unmentioned. What is wrong is the inability of a democratic system to contain the inevitable dissent and moral outrage. The conclusion appears obvious, and we may ask how long it will be before at least some influential voices in liberal America will explain the necessity for removing the major impediment to the achievement of what Professor Poole refers to as our national goals. Huntington, incidentally, appears to share the qualms of his colleague regarding the inadequacies of democracy as a political system in a period when, as Poole puts it, we feel massively threatened. Thus, he recommends that our involvement be kept reasonably limited, discreet, and covert, my italics. And he feels that even the shift toward introversion in our society may have side benefits, in that the more limited forms of foreign involvement to which we will be restricted will be facilitated, in the sense that there will be less public attention and concern to these issues. The plain fact is that democracy cannot fight a brutal, drawn-out war of aggression. Most people are not gangsters unless public concern can be deflected, unless intervention is discreet and covert. There will be protest, disaffection, and resistance. Either the war will have to go on or the democracy. And we're going to get to section 4, but I just want to make a comment. So you can see these are fascists. These are fascists. Samuel Huntington, Ithiel Poole of MIT, Samuel Huntington of Harvard are promoting fascism. The only reason that Vietnam was a failure in Ithiel Poole and Samuel Huntington's mind is that there was moral outrage, that the democracy was the limitation of this war. We would be able to do it if we were able to slaughter all the people who dissent, as well as all of the Vietnamese. This goes along with fascism. This is, a trait of the United States academia and corporate media and all of its government. They are fascists. They are restrictors of democracy, quashers of democracy, murderous American fascists, Nazi white butchers. So continuing on, in September 1967, the Inter-University Council of the Student Unions of Cam Tho University, Van Han University, Saigon University, and Dalat University directed an open letter to President Johnson in which they wrote, "The American intervention in the Vietnamese internal situation since after the Geneva Accord in 1954 has made the Vietnamese people regard the United States as replacing the French colonizers. The American policy, instead of helping the Vietnamese people, only pushes them into a destructive and bloody war. The Vietnamese people, principally in the countryside, have been living in misery, and because of American intervention, the country has been split and its struggling force reduced. If, Mr. President, you and your government continue their policies supporting the individuals without consideration of the Vietnamese people's aspirations, we will consider the United States of America as an aggressor instead of an ally fighting for independence, peace, and unification of our country." In June 1968, the Students' Association of Saigon submitted the following manifesto. After the Tet Offensive, the majority of South Vietnamese people saw that the country was about to undergo a historic change. After years of incessant fighting, the conflict cannot be solved by a military victory. On the contrary, the bombardment have caused more and more damage, exhausted the energy of the people and the national potentials. Up till now, this destruction continues due to foreign imperialism. The national civilization has become therefore desperate. Aware of the danger of total extermination and seeing for themselves how the bombardments have murdered the people, destroyed painstakingly erected constructions, the Representative Council of Saigon students, before history, before the people, before the whole student community, whose only aim is to serve the people. So I'm going to read that sentence again. Aware of the danger of total extermination and seeing for themselves how the bombardments have murdered the people, destroyed painstakingly erected constructions, the Representative Council of Saigon students, before history, before the people, before the whole student community, whose only aim is to serve the people, solemnly declares, it is now the moment to solve the Vietnamese conflict, to avoid the total extermination of the Vietnamese people. Within a few weeks The official newspaper, the Student Association, was closed and its editor sentenced by a military tribunal to 5 years of hard labor, where he joined the president of the General Association of Saigon Students and the many of the other officers of the association, as well as Trong Dinh Du and innumerable others. According to the Saigon Daily News, there are 100,000 persons in South Vietnamese jails suffering such conditions as these. The Can Tho provincial jail, which was built by the French for 500 prisoners, is now used to keep over 2,000. Other prisons through the country are in a similar situation. Detainees have no room to sit. Legs of most prisoners have been swollen for having to stand on their feet to sleep. The Saigon Daily News was suspended by the government on November 14th. The 10th newspaper closed in 20 days. In September 1968, Professor Lai Chin Trung delivered a speech at the Saigon Student Center explaining why he wanted peace. I quoted the initial paragraph. I wanted peace, first of all, because I am a Vietnamese. Being a Vietnamese, I cannot stand anymore the sight of Vietnamese blood continuing to be spilled more and more each day. Not only the blood of the soldiers on both sides, but also the blood of hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians, of old men and old women, of women and children, while a number of other Vietnamese unconcernedly seek after money and eat and make merry in a dissolute manner as if they were living in Paris or New York, or to be more exact, on another planet, since the inhabitants of Paris and New York may well concern themselves with the present war in Vietnam more than they do. Being a Vietnamese, I can no longer put up with the sight of foreigners who presume to have the right to destroy my country with the most modern and terrible means, and all in the name of protecting the freedom of the people of southern Vietnam. That is to say, a kind of quote-unquote freedom which the inhabitants of the southern part of Vietnam have been throwing up and vomiting out for the last 10 years already, without being yet able to swallow. Surely there are many Americans who honestly believe that they have come here to protect freedom, quote unquote, and I sincerely thank them for their good intentions. But they are mistaken, or they have been cheated, because if the inhabitants of the southern part of Vietnam had truly experienced freedom as an automatic result of independence, then they would have had more than enough strength to protect their own freedom without having to inconvenience anybody at all. But unfortunately, the inhabitants of the southern part of Vietnam have not been able to enjoy freedom and have not had the chance to be the masters of their own destiny, precisely because the Americans, in the name of the protectors of freedom, have in fact been protecting regimes which stamp out that freedom. And when these regions crumbled or failed, not because of communist terrorism, but because of their own decomposure, powerlessness, and lack of justice, the only way Americans then knew to protect freedom was by the several million tons of bombs used to crush to the pieces the very land of Vietnam, and by the gigantic streams of dollars which deluge Vietnamese society in the South. That is to say, by destroying the very roots of the material and spiritual foundations of this country. So I'm going to take a short break. It'll be like, probably 2 minutes. I'm glad you could join us. Okay, so we're almost done. It's just about 7 pages, and then we'll make some closing remarks, and then we'll be done. On October 15th, 1969, 93 Catholic priests and intellectuals now residing in France, together with a great number of Catholics in Vietnam, whose names were not just published for fear of retaliation by the Saigon government, proposed an open letter on the occasion of the moratorium, in which they wrote, "How can the USA be wicked enough to wish to exterminate all of our people, to defend an idea, a theory, which time has adequately demonstrated to have only been a myth and never a reality? Those whom the USA accuses in its ignorance as communists are in reality our relatives, our brothers, our sisters, our friends, dispersed in villages and hamlets. They are the only peasants, workers, peddlers, hairdressers, and herdsmen. They ask only one thing: to be masters of their own home and to gain a livelihood by the sweat of their own brow. I can obviously not presume to judge how widespread such sentiments may be among the people of South Vietnam. I doubt that any Westerners have the slightest idea of what is happening in the teeming slums of Saigon, or among the millions of refugees, or in the villages of Vietnam. In Vientiane a few weeks ago, I met two Americans who had lived for several years in Vietnam, not in American compounds, but in intimate involvement with the Vietnamese. One, a former IVS volunteer, had worked closely with Vietnamese youth in Saigon. They impressed me greatly with their understanding and intelligence, and even more by the sympathetic concern that they felt for the character and unique quality of Vietnamese life and culture. Both had left Saigon with deep regrets because of the hostility towards Americans, which, they report, only the most insensitive observer can now fail to perceive. Sentiments so widened and deeply felt that life is intolerable for any American who hopes for more than superficial contact with Vietnamese society. I heard many similar comments from reporters who had worked in South Vietnam. One would surely conclude from such observations that the information reaching Americans is of highly dubious quality. Other sources support this conclusion. Consider a recent study by Harvey Meyerson on the Delta province of Vinh Long, where he spent much of 1967 and early 1968. He returned in December 1968 to investigate the reports of great American success in the accelerated pacification quote-unquote program. A primary indicator of success, he notes, is the number of Viet Cong defectors, which rose sharply beginning in August 1968. The sharp rise coincided with a remarkable innovation, the third-party inducement program, whereby cash rewards were offered to persons who induced Viet Cong to defect. Studying the defectors, Meyerson made some curious discoveries. For one thing, almost all were quite recent recruits to the Viet Cong. In fact, many appeared to be peasants whose identity cards had been taken by the Viet Cong after the Tet Offensive, and who were faced with the option of either imprisonment by the government or defection with its various material rewards. Third, it appeared that the third-party inducement program was serving as an excellent device to funnel funds to inducers. Hence, no doubt, ultimately to the Viet Cong in many cases, after the inevitable siphoning off by government officials down the line. But most interesting was the discovery that of 145 defectors analyzed in one group, no less than 142 elected to return to their home hamlets. As Meyerson continues, a true defector who returned to his home hamlet would live in constant fear of Viet Cong reprisal. Presumably then, the defection, quote-unquote, was carried out with the connivance or at the initiative of the Viet Cong. The Americans in charge of the program were aware of none of this. Meyerson concludes, the Viet Cong in Vinh Long may have been collapsing, but if this was the case, the Americans in Vinh Long did not know about it. They could not know about it. They were living in a dream world. Quite apart from the specific study of Vietnam, one can draw the general colonialist experience. Gandhi, at his trial in 1922, explained how a subtle but effective system of terrorism and an organized display of force on the one hand, and the deprivation of all powers of retaliation and self-defense on the other, had emasculated the people and induced them the habit of stimulation. Hence the exacerbation so commonly expressed by the colonial administrator, unable to secure the active cooperation of the natives, whom he wishes only to help, though they always endeavor, as Lord Cromer of India noticed, to say that what is pleasant to the interrogator, especially if he occupies some post of authority. The Americans in Vietnam are not the first invaders to have learned this lesson. A Vietnamese scholar living near Saigon observes that what the Vietnamese hold most against the Americans is the social demoralization that they have caused. Whether they mean or not, they destroy what we hold most dear: family, friendships, our way of expression. Consciously or not, the Vietnamese see their intervention that way. Even the girl in the bar who has money now, who lives in town and never wants to return to the country, feels a sense of guilt. Even after 5 or 10 years of work, she still feels ill at ease, alienated. Something is missing, and she knows it. She would give up all the advantages of her independence if she could rediscover that something. The Viet Cong, he observes, represents a desire to return to normal. So the Vietnamese feel in a confused way. But for the NLF, there is obviously no question of resorting the thieves' honor to the rules of piracy of the past. The aimless, hopeless character of Saigon, the decay and demoralization, are the constant themes of those who try to describe the life of the city as it can be seen by an outsider. Saigon today stands as an example of what Indochina has become with American occupation. To a visitor, it is a hellhole of noise, filth, and misery, which no one should become accustomed to. Every street is jammed with Hondas, and on the dirty, broken pavements, they stand in gleaming ranks for sale. The bar girls on the streets with American soldiers are defiant, passing a battery of abuse from their own people. The Vietnamese families squatting in shacks along the railway line smell as though they are rotting. In the orphanages, the children displaced and lost by the movement of the war are lifeless, stinking lumps of humanity. In one sweltering room crammed with 30 cots last week, I saw a baby with a ping pong ball swelling under his arm. Bubonic plague, quote unquote. The fat slattern minding the children said laconically. Officially, there is no plague in Saigon. In Saigon, the legacy of American occupation is an emasculated, westernized city devoid of character, a people without nationhood. Saigon, as noted earlier, is now estimated to have more than twice the population density of Tokyo. According to recent reports, the trees lining the boulevards have been destroyed by pollution and perhaps also defoliants by fumes that from containers that are used for fires. Gangs of homeless youth roam the city. The IBS worker I mentioned earlier reports that the situation is reminiscent of the turmoil that preceded the fall of Diem. Demonstration by students and wounded war veterans have been reported regularly in the press. The schools and universities have been closed. The ever-present corruption continues unabated. What is described as the most colossal case of currency smuggling and corruption in the country's modern history was discovered a few weeks ago by customs officer at Tan Son Nhut Air Base. According to 2 Vietnamese senators, the ring of smugglers involves top officials and 3 of the 4 most powerful generals in the Thu regime. General Dang Van Cang, Thu's assistant in charge of the national security and pacification, General Do Chow Tri, whose troops are now destroying Cambodian villages in the Parrot's Beak, and Cao Van Vien, chief of the staff of the armed forces. General Tri, who is currently one of the American heroes, and like most of the others, a former officer under the French in the First Indochina War, is further alleged to be deeply involved in graft in the provinces within his zone of influence. But the real corruption is deeper and more subtle, a useful indication of the true nature of the American-sponsored urban revolution as it affects the more privileged, is given to by Don Luce and John Somer. When students at Saigon's teacher training college were asked to list 15 occupations in an English examination, almost every student included launderer, car washer, bar girl, shoeshine boy, soldier, interpreter, and journalist. Almost none of the students thought to write down doctor, engineer, industrial administrator, farm manager, or even their own chosen profession, teacher. The economy has become oriented toward services catering to foreign soldiers. Such is the social revolution that we have brought on to the elite of South Vietnam, those who have been selected as our partners. One recalls again other episodes in the history of colonialism. When the United States conquered the Philippines, domestic upper-class collaborators expressed their enthusiasm for American rule in such terms as these. After peace is established, all our efforts will be directed to Americanizing ourselves, to causing knowledge of the English language to be extended and generalized in the Philippines, in order that, though through its agency the American spirit may take possession of us, and that we may so adopt its principles, its political customs, and its peculiar civilization that our redemption may be complete and radical. The loss of identity, quote unquote, as is commonly noted, remains one of the most profound problems of the Philippines. Commenting on Latin America, Claude Julien detects a related phenomenon. The revolt of Latin America is not directed only against dictatorial regimes that are corrupt and inefficient, nor only against the exploitation by the foreigner of the economic and human resources of their country, but also against a cultural colonization that touches them at the deepest level of their being. And this is perhaps why their revolt is more virulent than that of the worker or peasant organizations that experience primarily economic colonization. For the same reason, cultural colonization, if it succeeds, is the most deplorable in its long-term effects. The Vietnamese scholar whose remarks were quoted earlier, see page 44, concluded his discussion by saying, "Mine is a country you either respect or destroy. There is no half measure. Up until now, no one has managed to destroy it." Vietnam has endured many wars, many conquests. Its resistance to American aggression can be described with no exaggeration as a colossal triumph of the human spirit. But there is a limit to human endurance, and it may someday be reached even in Vietnam if the world and the American people permit this monstrous war to continue. Two of the essays, this is section 5, two of the essays that follow were written in the late 1969 and early 1970. Three were written upon my return from a brief trip to Indochina in April 1970. And as was most of this introductory chapter. At the Bangkok airport, I picked up several books to help pass the hours of the flight across the Pacific to home. Among them was a novel by Kurt Vonnegut in which one of his characters, a psychiatrist, discusses a disease that he calls samaritrophia, defined as hysterical indifference to the troubles of those less fortunate than oneself. A person afflicted by samaritrophia follows the path of enlightened self-interest. His flag is the black and white Jolly Roger, with these words written beneath the skull and crossbones: "The hell with you, Jack, I've got mine." Vonnegut apologizes to the reader for bothering to give a name to this disease, which is virtually as common among healthy Americans as noses. But he points out the disease is particularly evil in its consequences when the person afflicted formerly thought of himself as benevolent and concerned for his fellows. Then when his conscience is subdued, he can become a mad dog, savage and vicious. As I have already observed, like most of their predecessors in imperialist adventures, Americans have tended to regard their involvement in other countries, Southeast Asia in particular, as an exercise in benevolence. Now there is too much information available for such a literate person, for a person with access to a television set, to retain any such belief. Surely everyone now realizes that Song Mai was merely the tip of an iceberg. One awaits daily the revelation of new atrocities sure to come. One day we read the account by former helicopter pilot David Bresson of the massacre of 33 peasants 30 miles from Song Mai. The next we may come to the news that the American 1st Infantry Division has branded its insignia in the Vietnamese landscape, bulldozing a mile and a half of jungle, an act that is low on the atrocity scale, no doubt, but that is nevertheless revealing in the contempt it shows for the land and the people that the United States government treats as playthings. We may read a letter from an AFSC field worker who watches American soldiers firing aimlessly into the rice paddies where peasants are visibly working, practicing. She and her companion are informed by an American sergeant. Or we may see the NLF report of a recent sweep in Quang Nam province, in which it is claimed in 2 days, November 11th and 12th, 1969, 700 civilians were massacred in 5 villages, with 1,000 houses burned down and thousands of hectares of crops devastated. Such reports have proved accurate in the past. Or we may look at Pentagon statistics on bombardment from 1965 through 1969. 4.5 million tons of bombs, 9 times the tonnages expended in the Pacific Theater in World War II, and this only half the tonnage of ordnance expended in Indochina. In Laos alone today, the equivalent of several Hiroshima explosions in a month, much of it is on civilian targets. What will be the effect of these disclosures? Perhaps one still hopes they may bring the American people to force their government to desist, or perhaps they will simply lead to habituation, to deepening our hysterical indifference to the troubles of those who defend themselves with valor, but who cannot, of course, strike back at the aggressor. I need hardly emphasize there is a domestic analog. The war has contributed to a serious economic crisis. According to a recent calculation, it cost $500,000 to kill one Viet Cong soldier, an amount equal to the federal funds which could support 3,400 people in school or college, or build at least 50 housing units, and about $40 million for a heavy B-52 raid, a sum that could purchase three 400-bed hospitals, or 27 elementary schools, or about 4,050 housing units. The cost of ordnance expended currently in the bombardment of Laos alone apparently averages $7 million a day. While traveling in North Vietnam, I was shown a bridge still standing uneasily that was attacked daily from 1965 until the termination of the regular bombing, with 99 American jets lost. The cost in planes alone lost must be on the order of $500 million to destroy one bridge. Even America's productive system cannot sustain these vast lunatic expenditures without domestic consequences. As unemployment and inflation grow, as our resources are wasted in destruction and preparation for new wars, American blacks, Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, and others are increasingly locked into the hopeless conditions of urban misery and stagnation. And as we know now, there is large-scale malnutrition, even starvation in rural America. The words "hell with you, Jack, I've got mine" become assimilated into the patterns of racism, the relatively affluent white society, and they become the last line of defense of who those themselves feel immediately threatened in their own tenuous economic situation by the reserve army of unemployed and dispossessed colored people pressing on them from a deeper poverty and misery of the ghettos. To anyone with eyes to see, it is clear that the present prospects are for a long, endless war, perhaps a general war with the peoples of Asia, if the American people are willing to settle into passivity and tolerate it. There is some acute commentary on the matter in a recent New Yorker editorial. The editor points out that opponents of the war have won all the arguments, but they have also found that it is inadequate to repeat these arguments. Why? Perhaps one reason is that the gap between the official explanations and the realities we are faced with daily on television and in the newspapers has become so staggeringly huge and so obvious that when one persists in making these points, one feels almost ludicrously simple-minded. It is as though the public had shrugged its shoulders and decided to accept the war as something that cannot be affected by human effort. The war has outlived the issue of war. The actual conduct of the war is developing according to a completely separate set of rules determined by the conditions of unspeakable brutality and confusion in Vietnam itself. There is surely some truth to this. It is hardly necessary at this point to win the debate over whether the war is brutal, monstrous, a war of destruction against the peasants of Indochina. Nevertheless, the real debate over Vietnam is, in my opinion, yet to come. With the mainstream of American opinion, hawks and doves divide over the question of whether the American people can stay the course until victory, or whether polarization and discord in American society make this effort inadvisable, not in our national interest. The question is real enough, but it is not the one that we should be discussing. In this debate, the hawks may in fact be right. The all too human Samaratrophia may in fact ultimately vindicate them in this case. That America has the power to obliterate Indochina is not, after all, in doubt. And who could predict what might happen if those generals, of whom James Gavin recently warned, succeed in embroiling us in a war against China, the ultimate enemy, in their paranoid fantasies? For those concerned with peace, there are several tasks. The first is to shift the terms of the debate to an entirely different issue. The proper question is not whether the United States can win at an acceptable cost, but whether it should be involved at all in the internal affairs of Indochina. Until this becomes the unique and overriding issue, the debate over Vietnam will scarcely have begun. The second task is to understand clearly and explain clearly what is really happening in Indochina. And the third and most important is to work incessantly to bring them home the hawks and doves alike, that the American people will not stay in the course, that the society will become ungovernable if the American war in Indochina continues to expand. For those who wish to work within the narrow margins of the political system, there is now a very real and quite rare opportunity, given willingness of some members of Congress to cut off appropriations for the war. But surely these are not the limits of legitimate protest. A person who takes seriously the responsibility of citizenship will refuse to be passive accomplices in crimes against peace and against humanity, and will undertake and support resistance to the lawless violence of the American state. A few weeks in Southeast Asia merely confirm with vivid and unforgettable impressions what anyone can discover for himself by careful reading and attention to contemporary events. The American involvement in Indochina is tragic for all concerned. It is deeply rooted in global American colonial policies that have persisted without serious change since World War II and that are still operative today. Given the anti-communist obsessions that have distorted and narrowed American life, the easiest course for any political leader will be to adjust tactics and try once again, quite apart from the underlying material interest that once clearly motivated the American intervention and still are not without force, quite apart from the pressure of the military and others with a vested interest in policies that once undertaken are difficult to abandon. This being so, public apathy and limited, intermittent concern may all be that are required to guarantee that we shall find ourselves at war with Asia. The people of Asia are, of course, the pitiful victims of these policies, but the United States will not escape. It is unlikely that we can continue indefinitely on this mad course without severe domestic depression and regimentation. For those who hope to rule the world, to win that, what some scholars like to call the game of world domination, American policies in Southeast Asia may appear rational. To the citizens of the empire at home and abroad, they bring only pain and sorrow. In this respect, we are reliving the history of earlier imperial colonial systems. We have had many opportunities to escape this trap and still do today. Failure to take advantage of these opportunities, continued submission to indoctrination, and indifference to the fate of others will surely spell disaster for much of the human race. So excellent first chapter. We completed At War with Asia, chapter 1, Noam Chomsky, basically Indochina and the American Crisis, 51 pages, 2 hours and 20 minutes. The book is available on my website. Please download it. It will be available, not on my website, it will be available in the description section of the YouTube video, along with the other book, Against the Crime of Silence, going through the specific, crimes by the International War Tribunal, all of the crimes of the United States government against the Indochinese people are described in this book, Against the Crime of Silence. The PDFs of these books are available for download. They are unfortunately out of print, and that is why the U.S. government put them out of print, because they don't want people reading this stuff. It is, their fascism. So let's, discuss the chapter. So we saw, a couple notable things I found. Aside from the bombings, we know the indiscriminate bombings, the butchers of the United States government, they're racist, white, murderous butchers. But let's, get to the real stuff. Samuel Huntington and Ithiel Poole posed two statements. The statements were that fascism is why if we don't have fascism, we can't win this war. He is a crazy, crazy man. These are, professors of academia at Harvard and MIT. The fact that democracy will prevent the moral outrage of this war is obvious. That is an obvious humanity thing. That is a humanistic concern. But these two professors promote fascism, forget the moral outrage, force dissidents into submission, imprison everyone that contests this war, and then unleash the bombing campaign against Indochina to the extermination extreme. That is the ideas supported by these professors of Harvard and MIT. These are racist American white criminal mafia butchers. That is what we see with these two people. In addition to that, the fascism, the colonialism, backing up the colonial French was the idea of this war. And we wanted to, force an imperialist colonial state of butchery, a racist colonial group of butchers in South Vietnam, and to overtake Indochina with colonial racism and subjugation, racist subjugation in the quote unquote American capitalist economy. The American capitalist economy is basically a state of enslavement for anyone in the third world. It is an enslaved system in which the whites collect the cash, they murder the Asians, and then they put the money in their bank account. They feel they're champions of Asians. They are champions of slaughtering Asians and then taking the cash and putting in the whites. It's called redistribution of wealth through murder. That is the U.S. government's policy in Asia regarding Asians, including Asian Americans and Asians in Asia. It is redistributing wealth through racist murder and redistributing to the white wallets. Murder the Asians and get it into the white wallets. And then finally, at the end, we discussed, the fact that the moral outrage of this war, that is the only way it would stop. It did not stop despite the moral outrage. And the United States, the American public, right? The American public has what's called samaritrophia. Samaritrophia is, the inability, the hysterical indifference to the troubles of those less fortunate than ourselves. Always thinking about ourselves as, under stress, under problems. That is what leads the America to fascism. This idea that we are under problems and nobody else has problems, and being preoccupied by your own problems is what leads America to fascism. So we see the entire enterprise, the corporate media, the corporate academia, the public, and the American government form the racist American murderous white butcher enterprise. So that's it. We're gonna continue with some closing remarks. I'm glad you could come. Tomorrow will be chapter 2. It is another chapter. Both Google Drive links are in my description section. Feel free to download. Both are, the one that we're reading. I recommend reading the books that I put there. Reading these books is very important so that you can get an idea of specifically what's going on in these conflicts. But I would read the books. I make some modifications. In addition, I don't have time to discuss the other one. So I would read these books. They're excellent eye-openers to American butchery. So we've discussed the chapter 1 of the book At War with Asia regarding the American racist butcher campaign by the white supremacists of the U.S. government in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The French plantation slavery system, cloaked in secrecy and white supremacist racist oppression, was similar to the American enslavement of the negro in the United States. This also follows their lynching of blacks, Mexicans, and Chinese in white vigilante orgies of murder against these people in the United States. The racist American murderous butchers followed French colonial rule with their own visions of racist subjugation of the Indochinese people at the guns of the U.S. congressional white supremacist, Nazi fascist gangsters, as well as their multiple presidents, including Dwight Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, and Richard Nixon. The war lasted 28 years from 1946 to 1974 and was associated with more than 5 million casualties, all Indochinese peasants, intellectuals, Vietnamese, Cambodian, and Laotian scholars, professors, and intellectuals. The idea was to destroy the democracy in Vietnam that the nationalists were trying to bring to success following hundreds of years of colonial rule. They burned books, murdered professors, destroyed universities and schools, bombed peasant unions, and murdered indiscriminately civilians. The butchers Lyndon Johnson made the destruction of Indochina his primary goal during his term, in addition to his racist, oppressive genocide against the Indonesian population. This anti-communist and anti-Chinese obsession by the Nazi American white murderers, fascist gangsters, was reflected by the question of Johnson as to who you are waging war against in Vietnam, to which Mr. Johnson replied, the Vietnamese people. Each individual atrocity is too numerous to account, but there are multiple sources, including the War Crimes Tribunal of Russel, which is in the book Against the Crime of Silence, that gave a good review of the atrocities committed by the American butchers in Indochina. The book reviews spinal cord snappings, amputations, decapitations, deliberate machine gunning of peasants and local intellectuals, bombing with napalm and burning of the skin of these people, vomiting gases used against civilians, white phosphorus, cluster bombs, B-52 saturation bombing to destroy the population, and near genocidal results of a massive use of indiscriminate U.S. firepower against the civilian population. The American racist Nazi murderous gangsters conducted gang rape by its soldiers of peasants in South Vietnam, tortured the population with drowning, electric shock, amputations, fingernail eviscerations, teeth extractions, cutting breasts and genitals off, decapitations, and other abuses. The basis of the United States war was their lack of respect of the needs of the third world people of Indochina to control their oil resources, the typical colonial, racist, American, Nazi, fascist, murderous gangster action that they have committed throughout the world. American imperialism was marching throughout Southeast Asia through military dictatorships in Thailand, South Korea, Singapore, and Indonesia. They could not accept the Indochinese people as equals and considered racial purity in their attributions that this race was a mad Asian race of bloodlust Asians that were murderers and criminals and low-level intellect. The standard American racist trope propagated by both their media, including the New York Times, Newsweek, and Washington Post, as well as their academia at Harvard, Yale, Princeton, MIT, Cornell, University of California, and University of Michigan, were all involved in this mafia criminal enterprise in Indochina. Major scholars proposed as the indiscriminate bombing of the people of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia was the only way to win this war and destroy communism. Their distorted and paranoid perceptions of communism were propagated by their Nazi, fascist, American, murderous white gangsters of John Foster Dulles and Dwight Eisenhower, who would not allow Indochina to fall to nationalists who sought their birthright privileges of oil, natural resources, rubber, textiles, rice plantation, and other things rich in the nation. This resulted in Dulles refusing the acceptance of the Geneva Accords and Paris Conference Accords, as well as Nuremberg trials in the conduct of this war. The South Vietnam regime was an example of an American colony. This repressive regime was associated with concentration camps, forced relocation, indiscriminate murder of civilians, police arbitrary detention and imprisonment, and large torture houses. The people of Vietnam were relocated to concentration camps where they were starved, murdered, and tortured. Saigon was also a corrupt tyranny which resulted in no financial gains for the government of South Vietnam, and all of the cash being siphoned by the United States into its treasury and stealing all of the money of the country. The racist American, Nazi, fascist, murderous, white gangsters did not pay reparations, did not apologize, did not make any attempt at closure with the Indochinese, a testament to their obsessive paranoid interest in worldwide third world enslavement, racist murder, and racist torture that they exhibited in the United States against the blacks, Mexicans, and Chinese throughout their history. So that's it. The last closing remarks. 2 hour, 30 minutes. Please join me tomorrow for chapter 2. Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. Have a great day.